Hello, everybody, and welcome to this very special episode of the Ant Pod. This is not how to keep leaf cutters or how to make a nest. This is a very basic episode where we are talking about all the basic questions you can get as a new or upcoming ant keeper. This can also be if you have been in the hobby for a year and you're thinking of how do you move your ants and should you go for an exotic species or should you make a naturalistic formicarium. We will try to answer all of the questions from start to finish in this very, hopefully, long podcast at the time of recording. We've, of course, just started. Today, I'm not alone, but I'm not with my regular crew. I'm with some totally different people. One of them being someone who is known to talk quite basic about ant keeping. We have Mr. Basic Ants, John. Hello, John.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thanks. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, this is your first time you're out and about, away from your own channel, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, that is correct. This is my first time I've got involved with other YouTubers and done anything collaboratively.
Well, I feel very honored to have taken your virginity on that part then. So, for those who don't know you, John, who are you and what is your channel about? Are you there, John? Hello? Can you hear me, AntBoy?
I can hear fine, yes.
All right. It seems we may have lost Basic Ants.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's come back. I don't know, a little glitch there. Something. It was an update happening. Sorry, on my computer and interrupted. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, we are together with two people who are not usually recording. So if we have some small technical difficulties, please bear with us. So, John, Basic Ants, for those who don't know you, who are you? And what is your channel about?
Okay, so I haven't actually been keeping ants very long at all, compared to all of you guys on YouTube and everything. I really only started about 2 years ago in 2020, during the pandemic, the lockdown. You know, it was something to be doing. It was easy, and as everyone knows, we sort of started lockdown in the spring, and I started researching, and I did a ton of research. I really did. I've watched practically every video you can imagine on YouTube. I've got to the end of the list a few times on some topics. But yeah, what really fascinated me more than actual ant keeping, I don't even consider myself an ant keeper. I'm more an ant watcher. I just want to, I'm interested in the behavior and why they do what they do and how they coordinate and communicate to do what they do. And that's why I only keep pretty much basic ants, Lasius niger and Lasius flavus. I don't need to go into exotics because that's not why I'm keeping ants. I'm keeping it just to watch them. And these two species, especially the Lasius niger, very basic species to keep, very easy, which we'll come on to, I'm sure. Great to watch, always up to something. So I'm really satisfied with them. But then when I was sort of doing all of this research and reading up on practically every forum and Reddits and everything, I started to notice, it took me a full year, around till 2021, I started to notice that people were constantly asking the same questions, the same topics, the same worries, the same fears, you know, what happens when this, and all of those sort of questions. And I just saw them being repeated over and over again. And I found myself answering these questions, like just copying and pasting my answers. And I thought to myself, you know what? This is a little bit of a gap in the YouTube market, because I'd watched loads of YouTube videos, like I said, and I thought everybody goes off into exotics and more complex stuff. I said, nobody sticks to this very basic topic that a lot of people are asking questions about. And I thought, you know, I think I could fill that gap. So yeah, a year ago in 2021, I started my YouTube channel, and I've kept it exclusively to these basic species, Lasius, kept everything very basic, you know, talked about everything that a new keeper wants to know, and tried to answer those questions that I have seen asked over and over again. And so now when I answer those questions, I can just link them to the relevant YouTube video that I've made. So yeah, that's about me. Is that enough?
Yeah, that is wonderful, wonderful. And that is, of course, why I've invited you to join the show, because we are trying to answer all of these questions, which you have answered a million times and also done videos on. But since there are not many podcast runnings, I thought we should make an audio version of this. And it was actually only supposed to be you and the regular podcast crew, but since we are recording on our off day and not our usual days, the other guys couldn't make it. So I was a little bit on the lookout for perhaps a third host, and that's when I stumbled onto Pete, AntBoyUk, who's often in the Facebook groups, also helping answering a lot of these basic questions. And I reached out to Pete, and here you are. And you, of course, and you're not a YouTuber, you are a store. But can you please introduce us to you, Pete?
Hi, Alex. Yeah, of course. So we've been an online store now for, about 5 years. Originally, we got into the hobby in relation to my son's interest in the hobby and keeping ant colonies. And probably like many parents of first-time ant keepers, we're very wary of having ant colonies in the house. How big do they get? Are they going to escape? And all the common questions and things that we'll sort of cover a bit this evening. At the time, there was a bit of frustration from my side in that there were only really a couple of stores out there that were selling formicariums and setups and equipment. And I found it a bit of a frustration with the sort of prices that they were charging and lack of range there. So myself and my son started putting some ideas together, started making things, and AntBoyUk was born, and we've never looked back since.
That is a wonderful introduction. And you have, as I said, you have then started taking this. You're often answering the beginner questions on Facebook. Is that just you're just a friendly helper, or is there any specific reasons?
It's always been hobby first, to be honest, Alex. I mean, the store is simply an extension of the hobby. So for me, the Facebook group, I mean, for example, UK Ant Keepers, that's been going 3 years. It's just under 2,000 members, and we've got a fantastic community on there, all very open and honest with answers to things to really help new keepers succeed and get the colony going in the way they want it to.
Yeah, and that is exactly why I've asked you to join as well, because I feel like in this group we have a lot of the same questions. They are, of course, the basic questions are hitting from all around, from Reddit, from Instagram, from Facebook, all around. And I thought we should do this big podcast to round them all up. So with that being said, we have now had a little bit of introduction. How long have you been keeping ants for, Pete? 3 years, or what did you say?
It's 5 years now, Alex.
5
So
years.
we've kept many species over the years. Probably the main thing that many people will find as well is actually not getting too many colonies. We tend to treat them a bit like Pokemon in that we've got to try and catch them all because it's such an addictive hobby. But so we're down at the minute to, I think, around 7 species at the moment.
Yeah, it is definitely addictive, that is for sure. But yeah, to end off, for those who don't know me, I am Ant Hollifer, and I have a YouTube channel called Ant Hollifer, and I've been keeping ants since 2018. And my channel is basically just focused around telling the story of my different ant colonies. And that's all the introduction you're going to get from me today. I think we should just jump in towards the topic of today, because we are talking about basic ants, or ant keeping 101. And the big question for any parents or any whoever is listening out here is, why at all start ant keeping? What's the purpose of ant keeping? And if I just start, you two have had a little bit of chat, so I think I'll take it a little bit to divide it out. And the reason I personally got into ant keeping, and I think the reason many people get into ant keeping, is Ants Canada. He's, of course, a very big Philippines YouTuber. He lives in the Philippines, and he has around, at the time of recording, 4.5 million subscribers. And almost everyone I know have started coming into the hobby due to him, because he have had quite a few viral videos. And he is one of the main reasons why we have so many people in the hobby. The thing is just that his hobby in the Philippines is a lot different from us in the Europe. We are, of course, all three based in Europe, but we will try to focus. This guide will be quite worldwide, hopefully. But yeah, it is. We are in Europe, and that's why we'll take a stand from European ants mostly, and go into exotic ants a little bit later. But guys, why have you started ant keeping? If we start with you, John, why are you keeping ants today?
Like I said, it's the extra aspects of ants that I really enjoy watching and love studying and reading about. And I read a lot of scientific papers, and I follow a lot of scientists, myrmecologists who are actually studying ants, and it is that side of it that fascinates me. I know a lot of people are into it because they like the pretty ants, or they like the big ants with the majors or whatever, but for me it's just all about the interactions and what makes them sort of tick. And I just love watching them, watching the behaviors, and almost trying to work out what that underlying program is that makes them do the things they do. And you spoke just now about Ants Canada, and this is one of my sort of big sort of things about this that we're discussing, is that my hero and the lady who actually got me into ant keeping is a lady called Deborah Gordon, and she has some absolutely incredible YouTube videos. I mean, she doesn't make very many. She's only made about 3 or 4 in total. But basically, she's a myrmecologist who for the last 20 years have been studying a harvester anthopogo species in Arizona, recording where new colonies appear, tracking genetically who their parents are, the parent colonies, and just following the whole progress. And she does stuff like fools the ants, like drops little pheromone balls into the nest to see how that'll change the forage rates and all of this sort of stuff. But yeah, I mean, her YouTube videos have had like 10,000 views, and we're talking about Ants Canada, like you say, has had millions of views. So yeah, that's something that sort of frustrates me a little bit, that most people aren't into ant keeping for the reasons that I am. But yeah, that's why I do it.
That is, I actually didn't know how great a crew we have set up. We have set up here, because I definitely follow the Ants Canada generation to come in. But I feel it's also good we have you, Pete, because you have, of course, joined this hobby with your son. Why did you start keeping ants? Did you just do it because of him? And why did he want to start ant keeping?
Yeah, essentially it was a case of me following him into the hobby and wanting to be sort of present and engaging with him about his new interest. But of course, you've probably guessed that his interest in it came very much from YouTube and from Ants Canada and the various other YouTubers around, 5 years ago. And he was very interested. He'd seen nuptial flights starting to happen here in the UK. And one day came back with about 5 or 6 different queens all in test tubes and said, "Dad, I want to start an ant colony." To which his mum gave a very succinct and clear negative reply. and I sort of thought, well, is there a learning opportunity here? Can we teach him some responsibility? What are the positives this can bring to the table? And how can we best engage with him? And I must admit, since that day, I've been more and more interested in them as time's gone on, and the hobby really grips me, within months of starting.
Yeah, I think that's the thing with ant keeping. It is for all ages. You can be young. You can be in it for all the reasons, because we have basic ants, John, who likes keeping them and seeing the behavior, and I just like keeping them because I also find I like the behaviors as well. It's just relaxing, just following an ant. And I think that's very important to say. There isn't a special age you have to be to join ant keeping. You can literally be all ages, because there's, yeah, the older you get, the more quirks you start seeing from the ants and the personalities. And like you said, John, with pheromone bombs dropping in, test the ants. I think it is a hobby for absolute everyone. And with that being said, that has been a little introduction to ant keeping, and I think we shall start the list of the basic questions and how you start ant keeping. And for those who don't know, an ant colony doesn't work without a queen ant. The queen ant is, well, the lady who produces all the eggs that turn into young developing brood larvae and hatches into pupae before they enclose as workers. But what is important here now is that the queen is pretty much, for a basic ant keeper, the most important thing in an ant colony. If you get more crazy species, you can have gamergates and different things. That is not for this podcast, because this podcast is for basic ant keeping. And I think it's very important, if you are a new keeper, that you can't just go out and grab whatever colony you want. You can't just get leafcutter ants. They require quite specific conditions, and it's good to have a little bit of experience before doing something like that. And you can't just grab random ants from the ground, because if you just take workers from the ground, they will eventually die of old age, or if you don't feed them, they will die of starvation. And that is where a queen ant is very important. Now, I want to mention that later on in this podcast, we will go into shops, because you can also buy queen ants from stores, but that is something we'll talk a little bit about later in the podcast. But Pete, what if you are out catching a queen ant? Of course, you have to catch a queen ant. But Pete, how would you catch a queen ant, and what would you bring with you on such trip?
That's an interesting starting point, and it can be quite basic, to be honest, when you're starting out. The first most important piece of kit is something where you're going to safely store your queen when you catch her. And in most cases, it's going to be a case of taking out a test tube with you, or something like the little queen hunting kits we do with the little valves in there. Just something where she can be stored nice and securely until you get her home. And then obviously once you get her home, that's a case of making sure you've got test tube setups ready to go, where you can introduce her and pop her away somewhere safe.
And test tube setups is something we'll go into a little bit in the next segment. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's obviously, recognising the time of year when nuptial flights are happening as well. In the UK, we've had them going for, the last 2-3 weeks. And we seem to be right in the midst of coming out of Lassie's Niger territory into Lassie's Flavus more and more now.
Yeah, and we are at the time of recording in start August, I think.
Yeah, we're just going into August, so just to be clear on that one. So Lassies tend to start flying around July, but again, it is weather subjective. They'll very much often tend to fly on a nice warm evening, perhaps when the ground's quite damp or there's a bit of rain in the air that's coming in over the following day or so. And they're the sort of environmental triggers that the colony look for to give the founding queens the best chance.
I think that's very important to note that we are talking, as again, we are European ant keepers, so Lasius Niger and Lasius flavus are the basic starter ants lots of European ant keepers start with, so those will be the ants we refer. If you are listening and you are from America, or if you are from Asia, or wherever you're from, a simple Google search should give quite an easy idea of what beginner-friendly species is in your environment, in your area. And again, here, at least here in Denmark, we do have ants flying from spring to fall, but the beginner-friendly ants are in these summer months. Is there anything you would like to add, John?
I'd tell you a piece of advice that I always give, like for worldwide audiences, if you want to know what your best starter ant is normally in most places in the world, the answer is whatever is living in the pavement outside your house, because whatever ant is able to survive in human environments, in cities and stuff, tends to be very adaptable and very forgiving, and therefore often, I mean, we're talking, normally it's going to be Lasius Niger or Tetramorium is the most common that lives in pavements around the world. But again, like we're talking about Lasius Niger, if you're in Japan, it's Lasius japonicus. It's pretty much the same thing. So find out what lives in the pavements outside your house. That's my tip.
Yeah, and I think, of course, a lot of the a question I often see from beginners is this a queen? Are there any of you that would be good? It's good to describe a queen, because what I personally look for, it's quite hard because here in Europe we don't really have major ants. Most of our ants are the same size. But of course, as there's different ant species, some ants have very big workers and small workers living together. And generally, if we are looking for beginner-friendly ants, they are generally very big queens. Some queens will be harder to spot, but most of the time, those harder to find queens won't be beginner-friendly queens either. But do you guys have any good queen identification things? Well, what would you say to a rookie ant keeper to find a queen compared to normal workers? If we drop the ball to John.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about Lasius niger, it's really simple. It's so easy. They will be so obvious to you if you catch the nuptial flight. And what I encourage on my channel, what I tell new keepers is, and it helps this to get people interested in the wildlife and the actual wild ants, is find your local colonies and watch them. Make it a habit to go out every evening at, let's say, 7 p.m. and just check what they're up to. And if you do that throughout the month of July, when they're having their nuptial flights, you will notice it. There will be flying ants everywhere. And then it's the big fat ones. They are so fat, some people probably don't even think they're ants. They might think they're almost beetles or something if they're a complete novice. They are much, much larger than your worker ants with Lasius niger, and they'll just be scuttling around everywhere, all over the place. You won't be able to miss them, and you will find a queen.
Exactly. It's very true. I also took my afternoon walk every day. Of course, I did it while I walked my dog, but also to monitor the different colonies. I could see the drones were looking at the surface, but they didn't fly. And yeah, it gives you a nice look around to just observe the wild colonies. But when you have this big ant, you of course have them in some kind of container or a test tube. It's a good idea to quite quickly get an identification, because there are two basic types of ants. There is semi-clusteral queens and there's fully clusteral queens. And straight away, if it's a semi-clusteral queen, I wouldn't say it's beginner friendly. You will have to go for fully clusteral queens, which are these Lasius colonies, Tetramorium, Camponotus, and therefore I would say if you get a queen, it's a good idea to get a picture of the queen and join your local Facebook Antkeeping group, like UK Antkeepers, and ask to the people of the group, is this a queen? And what queen is it? Because that way you can quickly start doing some research with this queen you're having in your hand. Like I found a Tetramorium queen. I didn't know anything about them, but I got the queen, researched, and yeah, now I have a Tetramorium colony. Is there anything you guys would like to add before we go to the next step, being test tubes?
Yeah, if I may, there's just a couple of points, and to completely back up what John's saying as well, definitely get to know where your local colonies are. We've got in our area, we've got the Lasius niger, the Lasius flavus. We've also got Myrmica ruber as well, who fall into a slightly more difficult category, being semi-claustral, and obviously requiring feeding while they're founding. So understanding that the type of queen, as you say, Alex, is really vital. Now, a couple of the questions that I see regularly when people are asking for identification, and they're perhaps either picking up drones as opposed to mated queens.
Drones what are drones?
Yeah, drones being the males. And the other ones are ones where people have potentially picked up a type of wasp. And that's not to be confused with the yellow and black ones that buzz around while we're trying to have a barbecue. It's more the more niche species of wasps that do look very, very ant-like. But the main giveaway on those typically tends to be that they have jointed antennae. So you will normally see, when you look at the head and you look at the antenna, if it's got a joint in it that makes it look like an L or a misshapen L, then the chances are that that's probably more of a wasp species than an ant.
Very good words indeed. Actually, I catch the wasp before, and you were actually the first one to say that's a wasp. But yeah,
I remember that actually. I've forgotten about that, Alex.
Yeah, I was so excited. I'd run after this queen ant. I knew it wasn't a queen. I thought it was a worker, but I wanted to get it identified, so I knew when to look for nuptial. and I just ran after it for so long before I finally captured it to just be told, yeah, that's a wingless wasp. Nice. So yeah, we have now captured a queen. We have them in some sort of container. We come home with this queen. We take some pictures, ask online, what is this? Is this a queen? What is this? And while we wait for someone to answer us, we prepare a test tube setup. And if I just take it, a test tube setup is a little pipe. I think that's a good way of saying it. A pipe with only one opening. And this will be the home of your future pet and colony. And basically what you have to do is put some water in half of the tube. You know what? Let's. I think Pete, you are the store. You will have the correct answer to this because I just wing it every time. How do you set up a test tube?
Yeah, so test tubes, they're actually quite easy to set up, but there are a few common errors in there. First of all, getting the right test tubes is important because when you get to a later stage, when you want to attach accessories and a nest and such, you will tend to find that certain size test tubes are the ones that are mainly catered for in the hobby. So normally that will be a test tube with a diameter of about 16 millimeters, which are widely available on eBay and very cheap and cost effective. Once you've got your test tubes and you get to the point of setting it up, I can't stress enough how important cleanliness is. So get in front of the sink, get the tap on nice and hot, wash your hands thoroughly twice, wash the test tubes out and dry them. Once you're in that position where everything's looking
Can I
clean,
just ask, how do you dry test tubes? Because that's something I often struggle with myself.
yeah, so either let them air dry, which is one way of doing it. So give them a bit of a flick and a shake into the sink and let them air dry for a few minutes. Or you can, of course, use kitchen roll, but you're really bringing in a chance of introducing contaminants into there. So I tend to let them air dry myself. Next question then is well, what water do I use? Can I put tap water in there? Is it bottled water? Is it some fancy, distilled water or whatever? And I will tend to lean towards myself bottled water, should I say? And the reason for that is because, of course, tap water does contain things like chlorine and such, which aren't necessary. They shouldn't be in there. They're not what ants will find in the wild, and really aren't something that would be introduced to the diet otherwise. So bottled water, nice clean cotton wool straight out of the packet. And once we've got that test tube about 50-60% full with bottled water, we're basically going to take a piece of that cotton wool, nice compact ball, and just in one firm sweep, just push it right down to the edge of the water with the tip of a pen or a straw or something of that nature where we can get it right in, ideally without any air bubbles in the water, but not to sweat it too much if there is a tiny one in there. The reason I mentioned, obviously, not getting any air bubbles in is that can encourage leaks later on, but if it's a small one, that won't be too much of an issue. Once that's done, then we can be in a position where we can introduce our queen, and she should have a space in the test tube then ideally of probably about an inch and a half, and we can put a little cotton wool stopper in the top as well, and that's her founding chamber. That's our test tube setup done and dusted.
Yeah, and what's important to remember, there's a very good reason why we use cotton. That's because the cotton on water, the ants can drink through the water without drowning. So the water will not seep through the cotton, but the cotton will get wet, and therefore the ants can drink. Rather, that should be the queen or the workers. They can drink on the water. And something that's important for ants as well, for most ant species, is to have humidity levels within these 60 to 80%. It depends a lot from species to species. But with this water being on the cotton, it also creates humidity. And the reason we have cotton on the other end is because it lets air come in and out, so that way the ants can also breathe. John, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah. I just want to, there is something I'd like to add, and that is there is nothing to add. A question that I see a lot, or something that I see on forums and everything, is what you've just heard about how to set up a test tube and what to do and how to put the queen in there. That's all you need to do. Okay, because I see questions I've seen. These are actual questions I've seen. I saw one person who said, "I think my queen is getting bored in her test tube," and he started adding in bits of stuff for her to play with or whatever because he thought she was getting bored. So you don't need to do anything else. They don't. If they're fully claustral, the types that we're discussing, they don't need feeding. They don't get bored. You don't need to add anything else. Just the queen into that little space in the test tube.
Yeah, and I think it is very important to note that this is the fully claustral setup. If you have a semi-claustral, you will have to do some research, because then you have to do a little bit of a different setup, but still a test tube based setup. And if you are thinking it's a bit hard to imagine this, if you go on YouTube and search how to make a test tube setup with the stuff you just heard, you can imply that and just see a video, because then they will also show how you put the cotton in and how it looks, because it can be hard to imagine. But once you have the queen in this tube, like John said, you are done. You don't need anything. I like to put I like to either hot glue a little bit on the water or something, just because this test tube is round and will roll around very easily. But just by putting some kind of glue, or I don't know, a little bit of different things you can put on the tube very easily, just to stop it from rolling around. And what you then have to do is simply to put them away. You don't have to look at them at all, and you just need to put them in a dark environment, preferably a calm environment. I have my ant room where I'm living and have all of my ants in, and I walk a lot near my computer and near my desk and near my ants, and these vibrations can cause the queens to stress a little bit. And it's common I wouldn't say it's common, but if you have a queen right next to a door or something you slam all the time and cause lots of vibration, that can harm the queen. She may also not care, but she may be a little bit disturbed. So that's why I personally have my queens in the opposite corner of my room, the part of the room I barely walk through, just because it'll cause less vibration. Is there anything you want to add, guys?
Well, I would say, if one of the advantages of some of these basic species, Lasius niger, for example, is that everything that you've just said, Alex, yeah, that applies to a lot of these more exotic species, but Lasius niger put up with a heck of a lot. You can almost inspect them as much as you want, and they won't care, and they'll carry on regardless and produce a colony. So they're very, very forgiving for new ant keepers when they're perhaps a little bit impatient and want to be looking at their queens and things like that. This is a perfect species for you for that reason.
Exactly, and that is why we have beginner species, because beginner species tend to be able to handle a lot more looking at the ants playing, not touching, but yeah, they are a little bit, they can handle a bit more. Just before we go on to the next part of the podcast, we did ask if there were anything you guys wanted to know on the AntPod Instagram. And the question we got is, do we prefer plastic or glass test tubes? Let's just start with Pete. What do you prefer, glass or plastic?
It's got to be plastic for me, Alex. Glass, yes, has lovely transparency and good vision into the test tube, but there is always a chance that's going to break, and if that breaks, it's going into your fingers, your hands, especially if there's children around. And when they do break, it's a total break on them. Plastic, on the other hand, much more forgiving. If it breaks, it will tend to be more of a crack, and far, far safer, especially when there are children around as well. Equally, when we then get to the stage where you're adding attachments onto the test tube to move them on to the next stage, plastic is a little bit more pliable. Again, it's not going to splinter if you force something a little bit too much.
I agree. Anything to add, John? Are you plastic or glass?
I'm glass. I don't like plastic at all. I find pretty much all plastics, even the high quality plastics, still have that little sort of milkiness to them, which slightly obstructs your viewing. And for videoing for YouTube, I think glass is the only way to go. That being said, what Pete has just said, I agree with all of that. And that's why, because it's one of the most fundamental things in ant keeping, that the test tube, and you're going to keep your ants in a test tube for quite a while. We'll probably come to that later. I spend money on my test tubes. I don't buy cheap ones. I buy scientific ones, so they resist boiling water. They are fairly resistant to being broken because it's proper thick scientific glass that you can put under Bunsen burners and stuff. So yeah, but I still prefer glass for the clarity.
Yeah, I must say I started with plastic, then I changed to glass just because of the viewing, and it does give, again, for a content creator, it is a lot easier to record through glass. But back then I always reused my tubes, so I cleaned them, and half my glass, I didn't buy the expensive glass tubes. I just bought whatever glass tubes, and I found that they broke, and then you did have this chaos with glass. So I've gone from plastic to glass and back to plastic again, simply because from my perspective, it's easier. But I totally understand what you're saying, John. Did you have anything to add, Pete?
Yeah, if I may, and yeah, I hear exactly what John and yourself are saying there. I suppose it depends really on the aim as far as your setup. And as content creators, absolutely, you want the perfect view and everything to be ideal for creating that content. I think for most hobbyists in the home environment, there's two factors in there. One being, where can I get the cheapest possible test tube and not spend, a fortune on high-end glass ones? And secondly, is there any danger to my children or my family or my pets in the area? Many people have cats who like to knock everything off everything they see, and glass test tubes just won't take that abuse if you're buying standard ones. So if you're looking to keep the cost of the hobby down, and aren't worried about a slight bit of cloudiness on there, that's why I tend to lean towards the plastic side of it, just because we're not shooting footage through it all the time.
I must say, compared to how half random you guys are coming into this chat, you are perfectly at arguing against each other. Very nice, very nice. That's what I love hearing, different opinions. Now, going back to the ant keeping part, now you have your queen. She's in her test tube setup. She is, I would recommend, in the dark, but with beginner-friendly species like Glacius niger. You can keep them in the light, but there is a chance that they eat the brood. But I would personally, for a beginner, recommend you put them in the dark. Now, the thing with ant colonies is you can very easily get a queen that is just not doing her job. And I would always recommend you to try to get 5 queens and put them in 5 setups, because I find that 1 or 2 out of 10 will just not work. And if you're thinking, I don't want to have 5 ant colonies, then you can always sell them or give them to a friend or something. Once maintenance and they grow a bit bigger than you want, you can always get rid of them. That shouldn't be an issue. But I would always recommend that you try to get around 5 of each species, just to be sure that they grow up and don't die. But with your queen in a test tube, depending on what species you have, if you are from Asia or from America, the speed may go a little bit faster. But if you have a queen, she will within, I say within a week, she will most of the time lay her first batch of eggs. And these eggs should slowly turn into larvae. And if you're thinking, I have to feed the queen because that's what Ants Canada have taught me, in this stage, you don't need to do anything. You still just need them to be all alone. There's a few people who like feeding them sugar in this stage. What do you guys think of that? Are you team sugar or are you team leave them alone?
I'm team leave them alone for the following reasons. One, they seem to have, well, Glacius niger seem to have an inbuilt instinct that's sort of like programmed into them to not want to eat until they've got the first workers. So sometimes, not always, some of them will eat, but about 50% of the time you offer them sugar, they just ignore it. Like they're not programmed to drink at that stage. And then the second thing is that you're introducing things into the tube. And yes, I'm sure we'll go on to how to feed ant colonies in test tubes later, but people, when they're new keepers, make mistakes, smear, like, let's say, honey onto the actual surface of the tube. And then over the time it will take her to develop her brood, that can start to go off and develop molds, and you've just introduced something unnecessary. You don't need to feed them. They're set up in the wild to not need to eat. So why complicate things? That's my opinion.
I agree. I 100% agree. What about you, Pete?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree, especially where you've caught the queen yourself. You know that she's been in the nest recently, you know she's been well fed, and as John says, it is programmed into them not to need feeding until the first workers can support that for them. I think there's a caveat to that, and the caveat would be potentially if I've bought a queen from a store, and that's maybe a queen from a different country. So, you know, that could be Camponotus nicobrensis or Mesobarbarus is a very popular beginner ant. And my take is that you don't necessarily know just how long that queen's been in that test tube for, and you don't know whether she's already laid, eaten those eggs, and if so, how many times has that been repeated. So when I'm buying from a store, I will tend to offer a minuscule amount of sugars, just on a little piece of tin foil. That'll be in for 24 hours, and then it's out, and then they are left alone for the rest of the period.
Very well said. I agree. I never feed my own colonies, but if I do get some ants in from the wild, from a store, I tend to always. The thing I always, if you are buying something we'll talk about later as well, I would always recommend that you try to buy a colony with first set of workers, just because a queen is a lot safer once she has her first workers. She is a lot more, the chance of her actually succeeding are a lot bigger from what I know at least. We have also got a question on Instagram saying what temperature should we put them at? And if you are here from Europe, it is just room temperature. Room temperature 28 degrees should be perfect for all species. That is why beginner-friendly species, like John said earlier, is the ants you have outside, because the ants that live in your environment are adapted to your temperatures, so they will be adapted to these 20 degrees. If you are from America or whatever, then you should, of course, try to replicate the outside environment again. But I would always just say room temperature for European ants at least. Now, when you have this queen in her tube and she has got her first batch of eggs, these eggs will slowly turn into small larvae. I usually say 2 weeks for Lasius niger. I say 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks, I think, or 3 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that. And once these larvae hatch, the queen will start feeding these larvae. And this is where sometimes the queen may eat the larvae, she may eat the eggs, and this may just be the furthest your colony comes. And that is why I recommend you always get around 5 queens if it's possible. Because again, you may get that dot queen that just eats her eggs and repeats the cycle and never gets her first workers. But in this stage, the queen will feed her larvae, and slowly the larvae will grow bigger and bigger. And soon they will then produce their own little pupae. And the pupae is, depending on the species, a little naked skeleton where you can see like a white ant skeleton. And over the coming weeks, it'll then turn ant color before it finally encloses and starts walking around. But for most European species, or at least Lasius niger and most Camponotus species, they will have a cocoon. It's still called a pupae, but it will have this cocoon around them. And it looks like a little egg. And this is where the worker will go from this white skeleton ant to this darker skeleton ant before she's cut out of the cocoon and you have your first workers. And with that, you now have your first workers. Now these first workers in an ant colony are called nanitics, and these ants will be very small compared to the ones you see outside, because especially nanitics are very small because it is the first generation and the queens have fed these workers only with the reserves she had in her own storage. And yeah, with these nanitics, what should you then do, John? What would you do once day one where you see your ant your colony has workers? Will you feed them on day one, or what will you do?
Yeah, as soon as I see workers, I give them sugar, and they will love it. Yeah. I would say to anybody, if you are going to film your ants or you want to keep records of them, record that first feed, because it is just beautiful. It's a lovely thing to watch. Very often, if the workers are very newly hatched out, or eclosed is the technical term, but if the workers are recently eclosed, the queen herself will go and drink from the sugar at that point. But it's just beautiful to watch. I feed them sugar immediately. Protein, you don't need to feed them until she's got a second generation of larvae that are coming through. That's when they'll want protein. So everybody worries about dead insects and when do I need to feed my ants a cricket leg, etc., etc. But the very first feed should be sugar.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It's very good said with that you don't need to feed them protein before the eggs turn into larvae. And the thing with eggs is they are almost, most of the time, they are in a little cluster of like 10 to 15 eggs all stacked together. And due to the ants licking them all the time, they have some special sticky saliva so they can move the eggs around. And that is how you can identify an egg pile from a larvae pile. Once they grow into larvae stage, they will be the same size in the egg for the first few days before they grow bigger and bigger. And then they will tend to lay next to each other, still in the same area, but they won't be stuck together. And that is where you'll then feed them protein. Do you have anything to add, John? Pete, sorry.
No, I agree. It's once we get that first nanotique hatched, it's the sugars that take the priority there. And it's a case, I think, for many new keepers understanding the roles of sugars versus proteins in the colony's diet as well. And in the species we're talking about, so the Lasius and even extending to many other colonies, the sugars really form the majority diet of the workers, with the queens taking some as well. The proteins are actually there, and the insect proteins are mainly there for the larva. And they're there for the queen to be able to increase egg production later down the line. So at this stage, as John says, those sugars are the really important part.
Yeah, and we are now at the first feed. So we have fed the colony sugar. And yeah, it's a very common question I personally get asked. How do I feed my ants? What do I feed them? And I personally, I've upgraded because I have a few colonies, so I've changed from honey to sugar solution. But we are now, the big topic of today, one of the big topics is feeding, because there is a lot of different methods. But if we just start with the basic, what do we feed our ants on? And there's a few different things you can use as a dish. You can either buy small 3D printed dishes. You can print them your own if you have a 3D printer. You can get small acrylic slabs where you can put the food on. And the thing I personally do is I grab myself some tin foil and I fold it into a small little dish and I push it in. Is there anything you want to add with regarding the dish, or have I said what I should say?
I started off using foil and found when I was putting it in or something, I hit something, it started crumpling up, and I didn't like that. And I've actually swapped now. I use greaseproof paper to feed my ants.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. You're not. Yeah, that's true. What about you, Pete? Are you acrylic or?
There's a number of options, like you say, to be honest, Alex. I think it's, if you're doing a very basic little setup, you can use anything that you've got around as long as it's clean. It could be the cap of a small bottle. If you've got a larger colony, it might be the cap off a milk bottle. But I'm assuming the plastic ones that we get in the UK here. But yeah, foil is great, but it can be a bit temperamental, as John said. I tend to use that more in the test tubes when you can just lay it in flat with a little tiny dot on there. So that's when the first few workers arrive. When we get in a bit bigger, yeah, I tend to use little 3D printed dishes. I find them very easy. And then as the colony starts getting bigger, moving on to dedicated honey feeders.
Very well said. I think it's also important that we will go into what to feed them in a second, but I think it's important to say also that a lot of people start attaching outworlds to their setup at this point, or try to move the ants into a nest, or they try to make the colony grow a lot faster than they really are growing. And you just need to keep them in this test tube. Now you can buy small different things. Again, we'll go into stores a bit later. But a company called Wakushi have made a very tiny feeding pod. It's around 2 centimeters long, and it can connect to this test tube. And the thing with these newborn workers is they don't go very far. You see ants walking all over the pavement outside. Newborn workers don't do that. It's very rare you see a worker that walks more than a few centimeters, and therefore you cannot put them in a big nest, because then there's a good chance they never come out because they are too scared. And the same with attaching an outworld. You're not sure that the workers will come all the way out to the outworld. So unless you know for sure, if you get like a small feeding pot that's only a few centimeters away, you can't feed them in this feeding pot. I tend to go for that option just because I like not disturbing the ants inside the tube too much. I like giving them a little space. But the problem with giving them a little space is there's not a lot of room for putting in a feeding dish. So I tend to add these very small boxes, only a few centimeters long, and feed them in that. And I absolutely make sure that I see workers walking out there, because unless I see workers walking out there, I don't know if they actually do wander that far. I had an ant colony at one point that had almost 10 centimeters to go out before they found the food. And the colony started dying. They had 5 queens. 2 of the queens died, and I saw that the workers ate the queens. Before I realized that I never saw any workers actually coming all the way out and feasting. From that point onwards, I fed them inside the tube again, and then the colony started growing for real. So it's very important to note that you cannot just give them a big nest. You need to use this test tube setup and maximum add a very tiny feeding area. Some people actually put the entire test tube inside an outworld. You may do that if it's something you want to do. It's a bit easier for expansion, which we'll talk about a bit later. But again, make sure you feed them right at the nest entrance. And I would personally recommend to just keep them in a closed environment within a test tube with a very tiny box, if all a box. You guys agree, or yeah?
Yeah, can I just say a couple of things on that? First of all, if you do put the test tube straight into an outworld or a Tupperware container or whatever, again, another common mistake I see people make a lot is they put the test tube in, pull the cotton out the end, and that's it, leave them. If you do that, you'll let all the humidity out the tube. Your very small colony will be terrified because you've basically ripped the front door off their house and left it ripped off, and they will retreat right up to the cotton and probably huddle there and refuse to come out. If you are going to open up the test tube and let them out into something like an outworld or a container, you've got to create some sort of narrowed down entrance, a hole drilled through a piece of cork. I personally wrap a piece of silicone drinking straw with cotton and stuff that in. If you give them substrate and there's enough of them, they'll create their own narrowed down entrance. They'll drag a pile of sand up in the entrance, but you can't just open up the test tube and let the elements in, basically.
Very true words. Pete?
Yeah, I agree completely with that, John. And it's a very common error where, the colonies feel completely exposed once that cotton wool's ripped off if they put in what we call a tubs and tubes setup, or if they put in an outworld like that. Very much for me, my take on it is we've produced a founding kit for many years, which is very similar, a small 3 centimetre square outworld that goes directly onto the test tube. The adapter closes the test tube entrance down so it doesn't give them that shock. But what I will, tend to say with it is a lot of new keepers tend to have a fascination with having as much tubing going on as they possibly can do. And that might be the case that you want, lengths of tubing running around when you've got a mature colony. This is not the time to do that. So as Alex said, what you really want is that test tube and where they're founding to be as close to the food source as it can be. But having it separate in its own little founding out world does bring advantages, because if you're doing that, you're not introducing contaminants into the test tube. You're not risking the workers dragging bits of food down towards the cotton wool where you might start getting mold or issues in there. So the notion of having a little founding out world on there, realistically, when you get to half a dozen workers, so when that first generation of analytics hatches, that's the time where it's going to work really well for people.
Yeah, I 100%. I feel like every time you talk, I come with the same response. I'm sorry, but yeah, I agree. Especially with if you are feeding them honey, if you are feeding them within the test tube, a common mistake is if you feed them too much honey, that it falls off the dish. Because the thing with honey, a lot of people don't, at least with Danish honey. I don't know if it's the same with UK-based honey. But we have like a really solid honey. You can buy liquid honey, but you can also buy quite solid honey. But even if you put it on a tinfoil dish, a little blob, it may within 24 hours become wet and drip off the feeding dish. And that's one of the reasons I've gone away from honey, and something we're going to talk about in a sec. But the thing is, if you then don't clean the test tube and you have honey all around, this sugary glue all around the tube, the workers may get stuck in. Because it gets very sticky after a few weeks if you don't get it out, and it may start to mold. And mold is something we antkeepers are quite scared of. Some people say it's not as bad as other people. Some people say it's very bad. Some people say it doesn't matter. Personally, I don't like seeing it because it can cause harm to the colony, and it's something we want to avoid as much as possible. And if we are feeding them in this tiny box right outside the nest, the test tube, there's a lot more of a chance that you can clean it properly without causing mold within the tube. And with that being said, I think we should start by talking about carbohydrates, also known as sugar. Like both of you have said before, sugar is mostly for the workers, and it works as an energy source for the ants. We both feed them protein and sugar. But sugar is mainly for the workers to let them run around. Sometimes people say, why are my ants, they never forage, they look tired. And it may just be a lack of sugar because they don't have this energy. And they actually do feed. I didn't know that. I didn't know it. But after I dyed some sugar and gave it to my ants, they do also feed it to the larvae. I guess because the larvae also need this energy source. But there's a lot of different things you can use as sugar. I don't know if you can actually use sugar itself, but you can use, a common thing to use is sugar water. And that is, I don't know what you guys use as a blend, but I normally go for a 1-to-4 blend, where I take a big glass, I take 1 spoon sugar, put it in the glass, and then I wouldn't even say 1-to-4, but then I take 1 spoon sugar, put it in a glass, and then I take water, and then I stir it up. So you can't see any sugar remaining. So it's just looking like a little bit of greasy water. Then I take the water with a pipette. By the way, a pipette is a golden tool in Antkeeping. It is probably a pipette together with tweezers is probably the best thing that you can have in Antkeeping. Tweezers is the thing you use to take in and out the dishes without using your fingers. And without, you can of course get your fingers into the small tubes. But again, tweezers are there to, I would say, make a safety distance between you and the ants. If you have aggressive ants, the tweezers can be long fingers. And if you just want to avoid any bacteria within your ant colony, just use the tweezers and make sure that the tweezers are clean. But with a pipette, you can then take the sugar water, put it on some cotton. That is what I do, at least. We'll hear you guys' opinions in a sec. But I take the water on some cotton and then push it, take the cotton on a dish and then push it in. And that way, the workers can drink the cotton with sugar water inside. And that is a very safe way of feeding sugar. It is also a bit more complicated than just putting honey inside the test tube. But I did once wake up when I was a new antkeeper to my 60 or so worker flowers colony only having 10 workers remaining because all of the ants had put their head inside the honey blob and they couldn't get the head out. So that is why I personally go with sugar water. But starting with you, John, what is your way of feeding sugar or carbohydrates?
To the colonies that are established, they get to try absolutely anything and everything. This is it. Like I said, I like watching the ants, so I try them with all sorts of different foods. But yeah, with new colonies, my go-to food is a cheap brand of maple syrup that we have here in UK supermarkets. And the reason it's cheap is because they blended it with carob fruit, I think it's called, which is a sweet fruit, which grows naturally. So both parts of it, both the maple syrup and the fruits, is natural. But because they've blended it, it's not really very good maple syrup, and it's right down at the cheap end. It's £2 for 384 ml. It's a little bit runnier than honey, so I don't get that thick, gloopy stuff. And yeah, all my Lacias love it. They absolutely love it. And it means I don't have to go out and buy expensive sugars or whatever. How do I feed them? I actually like to feed them on, like I said, a little bit of greaseproof paper, because greaseproof paper repels liquids. So what I do is I take a tip of a cocktail stick, dip it into the maple syrup, put that little drop onto the greaseproof paper, and then just drag it with the cocktail stick into like a line. And when you drag it into a line, it all forms back into little tiny balls, but they are tiny balls, no bigger than about the head of an ant. So there's no danger they get stuck in them. And there's a little row of them formed on the greaseproof paper. And then I just put a little tiny, let's say 1 centimeter by 2 centimeter section like that in for them to drink.
I think it is very, very, very important to note that ants do not at all need a lot of sugar. When I started, I usually gave them a centimeter of honey, like a big blob, pretty much bigger than the queen, and you don't need it at all. What you need to remember is the ants drink until their gaster is full. The gaster is the butt of an ant, and if that once that is full, they have the two stomachs, their own stomach and a social stomach. And the social stomach they use to spread food around the colony. So one ant can act like a fridge and have a full social stomach, and that ant can then go around and feed the other ants. But what you need to remember is their gaster can't expand that much. So when you feed them, just have in mind that if you have 6 workers, they cannot hold a lot of liquid at all. They simply can't drink that much because they are so small. Once you have thousands of ants, you can feed them a lot more because there are a lot more small butts to fill. But generally, they cannot eat a lot. And that's something I personally really did not understand as a new ant keeper. But Pete, how do you feed your ants carbohydrates with small colonies? Are you there, Pete?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, now again.
Sorry about that. Yeah, sounds similar to yourself, to be honest. So we tend to use our own honeydew formula, and that's quite a concentrated sugar formula that you water down. So it does end up being broadly the consistency of slightly thicker than normal water, if that makes sense. Obviously, the risk with that is, again, as you pointed out, that colonies and certainly young workers can drown in there if you add too much of it. So the way that I've always tended to counter that is, as you do, with a very, very small ball of cotton wool. And I'm talking, maybe a couple of millimeters round, is just very quickly dipping that in some of the liquid and then placing that on some tin foil in the test tube. That way, you find that none of the nanitic workers get stuck in it at all, but they can access the sugars as much as they want. I will also say that it's worthwhile making sure that you remove the sugars after a period too. I will normally leave that in there for 24 hours and then it comes out. I will equally normally then leave it for a couple of days before repeating, just because, as you said, they've got social stomachs, they've already filled up, and they don't need it there 24/7.
Yeah, very good points. The thing you need to remember is, especially with feeding food, is the food goes bad. If you feed them a massive roach, something we'll talk about soon, and they only eat a little bit, this whole roach will then start to rot. and that will smell in your room, in your wherever the ants are located. Ants generally don't smell at all unless you are lazy at cleaning them, because the ants they will pretty much take care of most colonies will have a trash corner, and you clean that out, and as long as you remove the food, it shouldn't smell at all. But again, it's very important that we want to keep all bacteria away, meaning that I recommend I go for 48 hours. But yeah, I recommend after 48 hours, remove the food, just to be safe. With bigger colonies, I have a little bit more loose, but in these very small, closed environments, we really want the best chances of these colonies to succeed. And all of these small things may be the reason why something goes wrong. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. Vice versa, there's very rarely things that go wrong with beginner-friendly species such as Lasius nigers. And that has been a little bit of the carbohydrates, the sugar. To round it off, I also use a sugar solution like you, Pete. And I simply, sugar water is what I recommend for people who don't have these sugar solutions. The thing with sugar solution is it is a blend that lasts a few months. At least the one I use have some chemicals inside that makes it go last long before it goes bad. Meaning I don't have to get a glass, get some sugar and blend it up every time I have to use it. I just have it on a bottle, and I simply feed them on a cotton, just like you, Pete. But going into the next thing is protein. And protein is a big topic because there's a lot of ways to get protein. You can get spiders from inside your house. You can get bugs from outside your house. You can keep mealworms. You can keep grasshoppers. You can keep crickets. You can keep roaches. You can keep a lot of different things as a protein source. Pete, what would you recommend for a beginner, and what do you use yourself?
Two slightly different answers. For a beginner, what you're mainly focusing on is having a food source that's readily available for you to feed your colony when they need it, but equally it isn't going to, if we take, for example, mealworms, going to pupate too quickly and turn into darkling beetles, because if you buy a big box of mealworms, your founding colony is simply not going to put a dent in those. So with founding colonies, fruit flies can be a very, very good initial food source. They're tiny. You can buy a culture of those which will last you for quite a while, and you can keep reusing that culture, if you will, to seed a new culture as well. So they're particularly accessible to new colonies because the little flies are very squishy and have a nice high protein content. Outside of that, yeah, mealworms work really well, as do small parts of, you can say crickets, but I tend to find they're one of the dirtier feeders. They will tend to make your room smell a little, so we tend to avoid those. But maybe little pieces of dubia roach, if you've got young roaches in your colony, they have, again, a nice protein content and go down really well with the colonies.
And the thing with mealworms farms and all of these animals is, of course, that you can actually breed them in your own home. So you can have a mealworm farm, you can have a roach farm, you can have a lot of farms. You know what? Before I answer it, let's just take you, John. How do you feed? What do you use for small? What would you recommend for a beginner, and what do you do yourself?
I'm going to be a bit controversial now.
Oh.
So yeah. Everything that you've heard from Alex and Pete is right. And if you are keeping any type of ant that you've, I don't know, paid money for, or that you are in any way worried about, you should follow their advice. If, however, you are keeping Lasius niger, which are 2 a penny, you can catch hundreds of them on the street outside, and you're listening to a lot of this, people saying you can buy this, you can buy that, you can buy the other, and you want to keep ants in a really, really basic way, and you're prepared to run what is a minor risk, what I'm telling you that I do is a minor risk. I feed my ants on absolutely anything that flies or crawls and comes in my flat. If I see it on the walls, it gets squashed and it goes into the ants. I'm selective on the size of things that I feed them. I wouldn't feed a new colony, I don't know, a wasp, because that's far too big. I would feed them something like a mosquito. But yeah, I have never bought a feeder insect in my ant keeping life, and none of them have died yet.
I would like to say it's funny. I like that you go all in on test tubes, but feeders, no. But I agree. The only reason I have roach farms, I personally use roaches myself. I have a massive roach farm simply because there's a lot of protein in a very little body. So for large colonies, it's very easy to just cut a roach up and drop it in there. Compared to mealworms, you have to feed them 10 mealworms to give the same equivalent as one roach. But regarding outside box, the common answer to people that does it to make it a little bit more safe is to boil them. Now, I must say, I am a little bit on Team John here, because when I started Antkeeping, I did exactly the same thing. Just took a spider in the corner, killed it, of course. It's very important to note, by the way, never live feed ants. No matter what you see online, for beginner species at least. Some species have to hunt, but that is not at all beginner friendly. Never feed live stuff to ants. They are scavengers, so they will not hunt. You may say, oh, well, I saw a YouTube video where they were hunting. I guarantee you, unless it's a hardcore species, they were not hunting, they were defending. Ants do not at all hunt, at least not beginner-friendly species. So if you put a big spider in a big colony, they will kill it because they are defending their area. But yeah, the common thing to say is if you are feeding spiders or whatever is to boil them at first. I did lose one colony for mysterious reasons, and I did feed them whatever I found. Was it this cause? I have no idea, and I will never know. But yeah, I must say I agree with you, John, because I've done the same a lot. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like we need to talk. Oh, okay. Oh, wait. I just remembered. Protein poisoning. Now,
can I just mention one thing before we move on, Alex?
No problems. Go ahead.
Yeah, just while we're on the subject of feeding founding colonies in test tubes and alternative protein sources, there's a couple of things to mention here. So, obviously, we've all got a refrigerator in a house. Don't be scared to go and have a look in there. Pick up some of last night's cooked chicken, maybe give them a little piece of that. Maybe if there's a piece of ham, and I'm not necessarily meaning the pre-sliced stuff that comes in the packets, because that can have a very high salt content. But any pieces of cooked meat, you might give them a bit of boiled egg white. Again, very, very small portions here, but these are all cheap alternatives if you're looking to use things within your own home. And I think one of the questions we get on a regular basis is, what happens with things like the protein jelly pots that are out there as well. And I don't know what your take is on it, or yours, John. We do supply jelly pots, but the rationale is this. They're typically there for if people are going away on holiday, if they're leaving their ants for quite a period, if they're in a position where there's literally nothing else to go to, it's something you can keep in the drawer as a backup rather than them starving. They would certainly not be my go-to, and they certainly wouldn't be a staple part of the diet.
No, I agree. I very rarely feed mine protein jellies or jelly pots in general. I find them it's very easy for them to start molding. I don't know if it's my room that's too humid, but I always have to take them out within a few days because they start looking quite bad, and that's why I do have a backup storage of them, simply because I bought a lot more than I would ever need. But you are 100. You are. I keep saying 100%. You're right with looking at the fridge. My first ant colony was fed around, I'd say, 80% on chicken, both raw chicken, but the raw chicken turned weird quite fast, so I decided to use cooked chicken instead. Just a little piece of cooked chicken cut in. I always used a scissor to cut it into small pieces so the ants could actually drag it. I never cut them small enough. But I raised a good Lasius niger colony to a few hundred, maybe even 1,000 workers or so, only on chicken and a little bit of the insects I found around my house. Is there anything you want to add before we go into protein poisoning?
I would just say that we've talked a little bit about mold. If the ants don't eat an insect, what normally happens, sometimes they do go moldy, but what normally happens is the insect just dries. It dries out, and you've probably seen them on your windowsill. You'll see a fly on your windowsill that's been dead for 6 months. It's just dry. But human food, this is what I'm going to say, when you do feed them things like bits of ham and bits of chicken, that does go bad, and it does go bad really quite quickly. So you have to be very careful when you're feeding them things out the fridge, that you make sure they either eat it or you take it back out fairly soon.
Must say, I'm so glad I got you two on the show. You're saying a lot of things I want to say, but I forget. So yeah, the shout out to both of you. It's very nice to have you on the show. But I think I've got a return from asking what people wish they knew before started Antkeeping. It's protein poisoning, and I feel protein poisoning it's for a big colony, it's not something you should think about, but for small colonies, it is something to have in mind. Now, what's important with ants is that in the wild, they may get food here and there, and maybe not in a month. That means that most of the time, again, it will be different from antkeeper to antkeeper, but I feel it's still good to have in mind when you're keeping ants, is they will always go for the protein, because they simply don't know when they'll have protein next. And the thing is, protein needs to be fed to the larvae. But if you have a worker, that's my usual example is you feed them a roach, the workers go out, they get the roach, they fill up their gaster, their social stomach, they're all happy. They come in with the protein, they feed it to the other workers. The other workers then tend to feed it to the larvae and the queen. And something I can mention is normally the ants you see foraging in the outworld will be the older generation, but young ants will tend to stay home and the older ants will tend to go out. So it's usually a crew that goes out and a crew that stays home. But the outgoing crew once more goes out to the roach, fill up their gaster, now they're full on protein, they come home again, they feed it to the other workers, but the other workers can't feed it to the larvae because they're simply full. That's good, the colony is happy, and they're happy. Then the next day or the day after, you feed them a lot of protein once again. Now, what can happen? Some colonies are clever enough to just say, no, we don't need the protein. And other colonies are desperate and they have too much in their natural instincts that they say, oh, we need to get this protein again. So they go out, get the protein, they come home. And the larvae are fed. The other workers are also quite fed. And what can happen is a worker have protein in their social stomach and they can't get rid of it simply because as soon as they got it out, they took something new. And what can happen is if they don't get this protein away from them within a few days, I don't quite know how fast it happens, but they can then get something called protein poisoning. And again, that is why I personally always feed my colonies once a week. I usually feed them on a Sunday, and then on a Tuesday, I take out all the food to avoid mold. But some people say to me, you need to feed them every day to boost the colony. But what you can have if you feed them every day is that workers can go around and have too much protein and they can't get rid of it. Again, if the ants are clever, they don't do it, but it can happen. And people have had founding colonies where the workers have started dying after when they're only 4 or 5 weeks old, simply because they have so much protein and they can't do anything about it. Is there anything you want to add, guys?
I'm going to contradict you a little bit again.
That is all right. That is all right. That is why you are here.
So yes, I've actually read both scientific papers that this comes from. I feel that the headline of that scientific paper, one of them was "Ants die younger when they have excessive protein" or something like that. I feel the ant keeping community grabbed that headline and ran with it. I've read both papers in full, and it's not quite as bad as you think it is, in my opinion. I believe what they did was they took ant colonies and they fed them a single food. And that single food that they were fed was a carbohydrate protein mix in one jelly. And they fed different colonies, different concentrations of protein carbohydrate mix. Let's say 5 carbohydrate to 1 protein in one colony, and another colony might have got fed 1 to 1. So it's 1 protein to 1 carbohydrate. The colonies that were fed on the high protein content in these jellies died off younger. They did a second experiment, however, which nobody ever seems to mention, where they gave the colonies 2 of these pots, but the 2 pots had different concentrations. So they gave them a 5 to 1 and a 1 to 1. Those colonies had no problem. They dissected the ants and they looked at the contents of their social stomachs. And when the ants were able to self-regulate the colony's overall diet, there was no problem. The problem only occurred when they had to eat that high protein jelly to get the carbohydrates that they wanted. They had no other source of carbohydrates. They were forced to overeat protein to get, and that's what killed them. So as long as you're giving your ants constant sources of sugar, they should self-regulate, and this will not be a problem in ant keeping. That's my opinion.
I mean, I can't say you're wrong. It is not something I've experienced myself, and I only do say it because I've been told so by other ant keepers. And you know, it sounds. I like that you have actually read the papers and you know a little bit behind the scenes, or not behind the scenes, but you know where they get it from, and yeah, it makes sense that they go for the carbohydrates, and the high protein can damage them. So maybe it isn't as big as a risk as I just said.
I mean,
but I
would say the only risk is if you feed your ants pre-mixed pots that are protein and carbohydrates mixed in one single feed, and that's what you're feeding them as an exclusive food, then you run a risk.
And you are a hardcore beginner. But yeah, it is something. It is something. That is the reason. Due to this story, I've always heard this. I got it told very easily, very early in my ant keeping career, and that is why I've always fed my colonies once a week and my big colonies twice a week, never more than that, except for colonies with special needs. Just because, I mean, to be honest, my colony seems to be self-regulating, which you also say is true because the carbohydrates and the protein is not together, but it's divided into sugar, water, and the roaches. So it makes sense. It makes sense. But if you have a small colony, and if you can see within your 5 worker Lasius niger colony that they have 7 larvae, if you feed them a big spider, you don't need to feed them a big spider the day after. They need some rest to feed this protein to the larvae before you need to feed them again, because what you do is whenever you open the test tube or open the outworld is you cause, no matter how careful you are, air will always come in and out. So when you are taking the lid off, whatever, there will come new air inside and it will cause a little bit of wind within the setup. And especially if you have quite an open setup, you can see that the workers firstly get a vibration and then they also get this new air, and that can confuse them a little bit and stress them a little bit. It isn't such a big problem with beginner species like Lasius niger, but it's something to note. And if you are feeding them every day and they have 5 larvae, you may cause more harm than good than just feeding them every few days.
And Lasius niger, especially, I've seen them do this, will store the protein that you feed them. So if they can't feed it to the larvae because they're not, they've already fed, they'll take it and they'll stuff that big spider down the side of the cotton up against the side of the tube. And then if you feed them more, they'll stuff more in there. And before you've got a huge, great black line down the side of your cotton where they've stuffed all these dead insects waiting until they need them. And then because they're in wet cotton, they'll start to go off and you'll get all sorts of problems. So you don't want them doing that.
Yeah, I think that is what is cool with actually feeding them insects. Is if it's small insects, like you said, a mosquito or a daddy longleg. I've also done that a few times. They can actually drag the food in. If you are feeding them a mealworm or if you're feeding them a roach, it is often a lot harder for them because of there's so much juice that it's often a lot harder for them to drag it in. But that's something that's one of the perks with actually feeding them daddy long legs or whatever you see around your room, because they can drag the food in. But of course, then they can make a storage within the colony. Is there anything you guys want to add before we go on to the hibernation topic? Have you said what you want to say about feeding? Maybe we can just say a little bit about keeping feeder insects after you, Pete.
Yeah, just a couple of things to add, really. I mean, my understanding with protein poisoning is very similar to that of John's. In lab environments, they do tend to use combined feeding solutions which contain both carbs and proteins. And you will find some of these recipes online. You'll see them on different forums and such, but they are very much designed for colonies that are being kept in labs under certain conditions. And, you know, when you've got that inability for a colony to say, right, today we need, you know, carbohydrates, or this afternoon we need proteins, if they can't separate those two things, then as John said, they can't self-regulate, and therefore you do increase risks. I think one of the big questions that I see regularly with, you know, colonies with the first 2, 3, 10 workers even, is I've fed them, I've put an insect in there, but I never see them feeding. Are they taking anything? I'm worried about them. And the answer is yes, they will be feeding. When a colony is that small, they will tend to come out in the very early hours of the morning or the dusk hours when it's later at night. They will come out when they feel it's safe to do so, when they feel there's less chance of predation and that they're going to lose workers. It's all about efficiencies for the colony at that stage. So they'll do it at a point where they perceive there's less risk. And equally, because, as you've said, you know, the social stomachs will only hold so much, they will only be taking a very, very small amount of proteins at that stage. And it might look like the feeders have been largely untouched, but they will still be taking them. I would make sure, you know, again, that you still rotate the food. It's not a case of leaving it in there just because they've not touched it. 24 to 48 hours, and that should be coming out, in my opinion. The main reason I say that is not just because of spoilage and potential mold issues, but this is arguably something we'll come on to, but it's also to prevent things like mite issues. And no matter how clean your house is, or whether you've got other insects, invertebrates, or anything else around them or not, you will attract mites if you've got uneaten food in your ant colonies. And it's a risk that we all want to reduce, even though most of them aren't actually too dangerous.
I've actually not written any topics down regarding mites. Shall we just discuss them a little now? Is that
Yeah, by all means. I mean, they are quite commonplace in setups at different stages. In my experience, the main way that they'll get introduced is either they'll come in with your founding queen when you've just caught her. So if you've found her in the streets, you've popped her in a test tube. I was looking at one of my founding queens the other day, and I saw a mites running down the length of the test tube. So that's obviously come in with her. But the main way they'll tend to come in is on feeders. And we can be forgiven for thinking, if we buy feeder insects from reputable online stores, that they should be arriving completely free of mites. But that's not always the case. You can't have anything that's completely free of them. So this is why it's always recommended that when you are feeding, you know, your mealworms, your dubias and everything else, you get a cup of water that's literally just been poured from the kettle, and you drop that feeder in there for a minute, 30 seconds. It will humanely kill it, especially if you squash the head on it first anyway, but it will also get rid of any mites that might be on the body of that feeder, which you will then not introduce to your colony. So it's all about just mitigating these little risks here and there. The second part is, and I alluded to this a moment ago, is mites aren't the be-all and end-all when it comes to, losing a colony. So you'll very often find, very, very tiny little white dots in there that you can see moving around. Now, they can be grain mites, they can be what we call buck lice, they can be a number of different things. and they're all part of the ecosystem. They'll be eating the rotting parts of any remnants of insects that are in there. They'll be cleaning up. They will not be attacking your live workers. They will not be looking at eating the eggs or the larvae. They're just part of an ecosystem. That said, they can be very, very unsightly, and if the numbers start growing because your housekeeping isn't very good with your colonies, they will start becoming more of a problem.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely something to have in mind. I caught a queen this year, and I took a picture of her. I didn't even notice before I got a comment saying she had a mite on her, and she did have a mite sitting on her leg. And there's these two types of mites. There are the mites that don't really do anything; they don't really harm the colony in small numbers. And then there are the other mites called I want to say predatory mites, but that's not. That's the thing that hunts the mites.
Parasitic mites.
Exactly, yes. And these mites actually hatch on to the workers or the queens and the brood, and they can hatch on to pretty much everything. And these mites will then start to harm the colony. They will sit and suck blood, live off the ants. And this is the dangerous thing is that one colony may be able to handle it, but if you use the same tweeze to go in and take the feeding dish and then go into the next colony, you can actually spread the mites around, which can be very harmful for some of the colonies because some colonies may just the workers may die of these mites, and then you don't have the workers going out eating that comes home with the food and supplies the colony, and then a colony can die. And it's not something, as far as I'm aware, it's not so common in Europe. It may well be, but not as far as I'm aware. It's a lot in these tropical countries. That's where I've personally heard a lot of mite stories where mites can really kill colonies. But I still try to take care. I can't lie. I am lazy, and that is one of my big weaknesses with having a lot of ant colonies. You can get lazy. But I recommend to try to sterilize. But if you have a tweezer, I did at one point have a tweezer for each colony, just to make sure I didn't mix them up. That was before I got too many colonies, but it's definitely something to have in mind. And these mites can then live off your workers and kill colonies if they take a overhand. Is there anything you want to add, John, or will you? Can you explain how we hunt the mites down?
Well, luckily I haven't had any mite problems, so I haven't had to look into this too much yet. I know the answer. You can buy, like you said, there is a predatory mite which is sold online, whose objective in life is to hunt down and eat mites. So you can introduce a mite to hunt the mites.
Yeah, exactly. That is also what I've been aware of. That these mites, if you have naturalistic setups, these mites can also hunt the springtails, but that's something for later on. Pete, do you have any experience with these parasitic mites? Because I am just like John. I haven't really got anything else than just heard about them. Haven't. I don't know too much.
I've not first-hand experience, but I have worked with keepers who've been through the issue. As you say, being in Europe and particularly myself in the UK, you tend not to get many issues with parasitic mites. As you described them, these are mites which will attach themselves to the ants, still attached to the legs, to the underside of the legs, around the gasters, and they will draw blood from the host ants and from potentially larvae and such. In my experience, they tend to be darker in colour, so they're not the little pale ones that you might see running around the test tube. They are ones that are located on the live ants and have that darker coloration. In my experience, they tend to come in more with species which have been purchased, in particular Asian species. So I've seen them on Carabera colonies. I've seen them on harps as well, and harps tend to be particularly vulnerable to parasitic mites. The way that the keepers involved in that got around it were to use some of the predatory mites that you talk about, which actually targets, as you say, the parasitic mites themselves. The predatory ones are called hypoaspis mites, and they will literally eat the predatory mites, the parasitic mites, but not target your ants, which is a win-win situation. Of course, the downside is that they will, as you say, potentially target springtails in a natural setup, and potentially any other microorganisms that you might have in your biosubstrate as well. So best avoided if possible, but they are a good solution if you've identified that you have parasitic mites in your colony.
Yeah, and I think that has been very, very well said. I think mites is something that once you have them, that's when you can start going crazy and doing research, because I feel like that's my own perspective. I haven't seen them a lot. But the one thing is to note is to make sure if one colony has mites, try everything you can not to make them come from one colony to another colony. That is also why I have fed one colony and I thought, damn, they shouldn't have had that roach. That was maybe too much. I never take it out and give it to another colony, just because you never know. You never know if there's something you can't see that suddenly takes a jump and you transfer it from one colony to another. That is my own advice, at least. Just keep them as separate as you can, colonies. They can stand right next to each other and never even know that two colonies next to each other. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. But now to a very controversial topic, I feel like. Now this will be a topic only for people who have cold winters with snow and colder environments. Hibernation. And this is a big topic because a lot of people don't trust it. I personally take it very serious. And I know, John, by your tutorial last year, you also take it very serious. I almost want to say, can you introduce hibernation? Well, I can just introduce hibernation. In hibernation, in winter, you don't see ants outside foraging, and that is simply because they are underground. Only about, I think it's around 1.5 meters underground. It is 10 degrees year around, simply because the earth, the core of the earth heats up the earth. So it's always these 10 degrees if they just dig a little bit down. The snow and the freezing weather will never cool down the dirt under around 1.5 meters. So in the wild, as far as I'm aware, please correct me, guys, if you'd not agree. As far as I'm aware, ants, they cover up the entrance holes. Maybe they have one open for that odd scavengers look around, but else they cover up the doors and they go this around 1 to 1.5 meters underground and just go into diapause. Now, a word you also hear is hibernation, diapause. Hibernation is that you turn completely off, as far as I know, and diapause is that you are just slowing down. And I think the official word for ant keeping is actually diapause, because the ants don't sleep. Their speed simply decreases by a mile. But I think, John, will you? I feel like just by last year you did some very detailed. You did some very detailed videos to hibernation. How do you hibernate your ants? And is there anything you want to add regarding what I just said?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I did a very detailed video on hibernation. I mean, do you want me to go through my whole process?
I mean, we can talk about our processes. I think you will be. I can say my process, and then you can say your way, because you're doing it the correct way. I'm doing it the lazy way. So the way I hibernate my ants, again, if you have exotic ants, something we'll talk about later, you don't need hibernation unless they come from North America, where you also have winter. I think it's North America. But it's species specific. But beginner species, the ants you see outside. Do we have winter outside? If you're in Europe, most of the time, yes. And what I tend to do with my ant colonies is I have a dedicated mini fridge. Now you can use your basement, you can use your attic. I think we'll go back to that after our different talks, because there's a lot of different ways you can hibernate. But I have a designated mini fridge. It is a very cheap fridge. It's a very dumb fridge. But what I do is I take my ants into a cold room that isn't heated. And in winter, these colder rooms are around 18 degrees if there are not any heat on the rooms. And what I then do is I cover them up in a cloth so they are like insulated, and I put them. I turn on my fridge and I get the setting that is the hottest setting. My mini fridge goes to 10 degrees, so I put it to 10 degrees and then I turn it off. Then I get my ants, put them inside this turned off mini fridge, and I turn it on. That is my experience, and that way you cool the ants down to 10 degrees a little bit rapidly compared to John. And then 2 weeks later, I turn the fridge just a little bit colder, so it is these 7 to 8 degrees, and that is how I get my ants to hibernation. Do we feed the ants in hibernation? We'll talk about that in a second. John, how do you hibernate your ants?
Yeah, pretty much the same. I don't bring them down that slowly. I'm not that obsessive about it. I do like to give them plenty of warning, though, that hibernation's coming. I like to give them about 2 weeks at sort of that 18 degrees that you've said. But yeah, if you want me to talk about hibernation, so first of all, I will say that I actually had someone who I do talk to on Discord, who's one of my subscribers, who had quite a lot of Lasius niger colonies last year, and he I mean, he ran the experiment, but he was constantly communicating and sending me pictures. I think he had about 10 colonies, and he put half of them into hibernation and kept half of them out, and we've observed all the results and checked. Yeah, with Lasius niger, this is what I will see all over the internet, all the mistakes that get made. People try to get without hibernation. If you don't hibernate your Lasius niger colony, they will stop. Okay, it might take them all the way round to March. Some of the colonies were still going in February, but when we ran this test, all the colonies that we didn't hibernate stopped. The queen will stop laying eggs, the workers will stop foraging, the larvae will stop turning into pupa, and all of them will just sit there in their tube, waiting for the cold to come. And by now you're in March and the cold didn't come, and you're then left with a stagnated colony that's not growing, that's not exploding into the spring, which is what will happen if you do hibernate.
Can I just pop in? The reason a colony stops is because when they go in hibernation in nature, they can't get out and feed. They can't go out and hunt insects because insects also disappear in winter. And that way they can't feed the larvae, and that's why the colony stops, because they just have to survive these winter months before they get going again. So that is why they slow down in the wild.
Exactly, yeah. That's why they're doing this. But I often see people who think they can skip hibernation and things will be okay. And I often see posts from people in sort of December, January, even February going, yeah, my ants are still fine. They will stop. Lasius niger, definitely. Other species, I mean, Tetramorium, by the way, if we're talking about those as a starter species, are completely different because there's 2 ways that ants hibernate, and they are the opposite way to Lasius niger, and they don't necessarily need hibernating. They rely just on temperature as their cue, whereas Lasius niger and other British species, so the Formicas and the Myrmicas, they all can pick up clues from the environment as well as just the temperature, and they know that winter is coming, or it should be coming, and they will slow down and stop anyway, like I said. So yeah, you have to basically get them down to less than 10 degrees is ideal, but without freezing. It's possible that some species can survive freezing because they produce an antifreeze over winter. But what I always say to people who are watching my channel is, why risk it? Don't let them freeze. And you can use anything. I mean, 10 degrees is actually quite warm, and you'll be surprised at what doesn't freeze. People think if they put them like in their garage or the loft or something like that, they'll freeze. If you put a thermometer in your garage over winter, because it shares a wall with your house and your house bleeds heat into it, I bet you it never actually freezes, and they'll be all right. But yeah, like as we've discussed, they will stop development. The larvae will stop turning into pupa. The eggs will, the queen will stop laying eggs. At one point, they will actually feed any remaining eggs to the larvae to get ready for hibernation. So it is important that you send them like a signal to say to them, hey girls, it's time to get ready. And that's why I give mine 2 weeks at about sort of 16 to 18 degrees, just in a cold room normally. And then I give mine 3.5 months in, again, like Alex, in a mini fridge. But as he said, anywhere you can keep between 0 and 10, even your normal fridge, you can put them in the salad drawer of that. And this is one of the things that I always say to new keepers when they're trying to put their ants into formicariums. We've discussed people making that mistake, putting a small colony into formicariums. Is one reason you want to keep your ants in their test tube is it's a whole lot easier to pop a little tiny test tube into your fridge, especially if you put it in a cardboard box or something first, a small cardboard box. It's just there. They're not escaping. I mean, I know your parents and things like that will probably say, what, you're not putting ants in the fridge? But honestly, if it's just in a cardboard box, they'll never see an ant, and it's a lot easier to do that with a test tube than a full formicarium.
Yeah, I can't say anything then. I think I personally say between 5 and 8. That is what I'm aiming for. But yeah, like you say, as long as it isn't freezing, you should be all right. AntBoy, Pete, how do you hibernate, or do you have anything you want to add?
I'm going to completely agree with both of you. So yeah, team hibernation, it's the way to go. The queens do need that time to arguably recharge, have a rest from the laying that they do year round, and it's built into them. We talk about the nature nurture debate. This is the nature that's built into them. It's hardwired into their genetics that they have a break as the weather turns and the colder temperatures come in. So yeah, we hibernate. Personally, I use our garage. Our garage isn't adjoining to the house, so it's a detached one, so it doesn't get the heat coming through the wall. But I do place them in a large polystyrene box, so that ensures that if there was any particularly adverse sub-zero temperatures, that they would, pass through that quite easily because of the insulation. I tend to pop one of our little smart sensors in there, and that is connected to my phone via Bluetooth, so I can look at a glimpse and just check what the temperatures are if it's a particularly cold or warm day. But again, target temperatures around that 5 to 10 degrees, with 8 being the ideal, and give them a nice long hibernation. That October to March time is so important for them.
Yeah, that's actually something. Before we talk dates, when you have your ant colony, if you have a Lasius niger colony, you should have around these 15-20 workers. The second generation should be hatching if you have caught your queen early. If your queen is late, some people can get very worried that if they don't have any if they don't have their first workers before hibernation, you may be in a bit of trouble. But if you just have the first generation, you should be all right. But generally, if your queen is good and you've done well, your colony should have the second generation hatching. So you have these maybe 15-20 workers, but nothing more, because a lot of people do expect them to grow very fast, but ants generally doesn't, at least not European ants, at least not the first two years. That is some quite slow years. But I personally, in the beginning of October, for me, it's a nice break because I have a lot of colonies, so it's nice for me to put them in hibernation because it's a lot less maintenance. Because doing hibernation, that's something to add, you don't have to feed them because, again, in nature, the ants lock the door, go under bed and hide. You don't need to feed them because the ants will simply not go out and eat. I do feed mine once a month just because I'm scared. I've never seen any ant actually touch it. But I do feed them in the little mini outworld, so I don't disturb them within the nest. But I just give them just because if they want it, they have food once a month. But I've never seen them actually eat anything. But I start hibernation, put them in a cold room in October, and around same as you, John. 2 weeks later, I take them in the fridge at 10 degrees, and once November comes, I turn the fridge down to 8 degrees, these 7 to 8 degrees. And once February comes, that is where I normally take my ants out. The thing to remember is you just need around 3 months. That is, I think you can explain that, John, if I'm not wrong.
Well, again,
can I give it to you?
yeah. when I started Antkeeping, as I said, at the start, we were in the coronavirus. And one of the advantages of that was that JSTOR allowed me to access more scientific papers for free. So I was reading a ton of scientific papers in my first year on ants. There was a group of scientists who did some experiments on now Lasius japonicus. So this is basically Lasius niger that lives in Japan. It's a slightly different species to Lasius niger. So let's first rule of ant keeping: don't take something you know about one species and assume that it is true about another. But we can probably assume that they're very similar Lasius and that they will follow similar characteristics. What they did was they looked at their larvae, and their larvae had to experience 90 days below 10 degrees before they would turn into pupa. They were looking at it from a Y point of view, and the reason why is it's to stop them accidentally pupating for an unseasonably warm period in the middle of winter. They almost internal body clock are able to count 90 cold days, and only then would they be prepared to pupate. So that's where you get they must have 3 months from, or where I get it from, that paper. But like I said, be very careful about saying something about one species and applying it to another.
I love having you too. I love that you have so much info. I'm the ant keeper who have seen a lot of videos, and now I'm explaining what I've seen. But it's so nice to actually have some proper readers with us, so actually to quote a little bit more of the articles. Have we covered hibernation enough to talk about how you get your ants out of hibernation, or is there anything more you want to add within hibernation before we take them out?
Yeah, the main danger of hibernation will be your ants drying out. And fridges are very dry environments. The fridge sucks the water out the air and basically freezes it on the back plate. You'll see the ice build up on your back plate. So fridges are super dry environments, and all through hibernation, if they're in a test tube with water, it's not a problem. But later on, when you have ants in nests, you've got to make sure, A, that they do have a drinking water source through hibernation, an actual water test tube or water tower or something attached to the nest, and B, you don't let the nest dry out, because like I said, the fridge environment will tend to suck the moisture out a lot quicker than normal, because the ants drying out is what will kill your colony in hibernation, if anything does.
Yeah, that is it is so true. That's also why if you have them in an outworld, if you have a big colony in a nest, it's very important to give them a source of water. Preferably, what I do sometimes is I disconnect the outworld and I connect the test tube. So when they go out to get their drinks, if you have something we're going to talk about soon, is when you have a bigger setup, you of course have your water solution, your water source in the outworld or connected to the setup, because in the nest there is not necessarily a water source, and in hibernation they can't dry out because they don't have a water source and they don't necessarily go all the way out to forage. So that's why I personally disconnect the outworld and connect the test tube. So if they're leaving the nest, they're simply hitting a test tube and they can drink from that. That is the best way and easiest way for them to actually stay hydrated during the fridge time. I also want to add something that can be important is if you have a drying test tube. We're going to talk about moving ants just in a sec. But if you have a drying test tube, I would try to move the ants into a fresh test tube before hibernation, just because it is 3 to 4 months without actually being able to really handle them. Of course, you can handle them if you want, but it's recommended to just leave them alone in the cold. And in that time, the tube may dry out if it's a little bit empty. So that's also something to have in mind before going in. Anything else we want to add before we have to talk about taking them out? I'll take that as a no.
No.
Oh, wonderful. So again, just because I heard you're very detailed. Okay, so when you are taking the ants out of hibernation, what I had happened multiple times is I turned the fridge off, I took the ants out, and very luckily, the day I took them out, the test tube flooded. It wasn't the day in the fridge, but it was the day I took them out. So that was very lucky for me to observe that. Except it's just nature being nature, and it is because I am just taking them out of the fridge. And the thing with water is it can leak through. You know what? Again, I think John, can I drop it to you? Can I drop it to you?
Yeah, basic physics. The colder water gets above freezing, the less space it takes up. So as the water chills in your fridge, the water takes up less space. That means it contracts within the cotton wool that's separating your ants from the water. And because it's contracting within the cotton wool, that then allows the cotton wool to absorb more water. So now it's got more water in at a colder temperature than it had when it was warmer. As soon as you bring the test tube out of the fridge and you start to warm it up, that water starts to take up more space than it did before, i.e. it expands. The expanding water has to go somewhere, and that's where it floods into your tube.
And that is something we don't want, because that can drown the queen, that can drown the workers, it can drown the brood. We don't ever want standing water near our ants, unless it's an escape prevention. More on that later. So what I tend to do is I turn the fridge. It's like from these 5 to 7. I turn it up to 10, so it's at 10 degrees. Then I turn the fridge off and put it. Again, it's a bit hard for some people. I try to do it as good as I can, simply because I've had so many accidents over the years of just turning the fridge off and taking the ants out and looking at them, and then seeing it start flooding. So what I do is I tend to try to get the ants out of the fridge and into a cold environment over like a 3-day period, from turning the fridge to as hot as possible, then taking the ants out and putting them in a cold room before finally taking them into the ant room or the ant position or wherever the ants are located. And just to give the water the most natural heating up way to not flood your ants. And in this process, I am very observant in looking at the ants to see if they are flooding. Pete, do you have any? What do you do? Of course, you're just using the little bit more the basic way, just by using your garage. How do you get your ants out of hibernation?
Yeah, so like I say, I mean, we use the large polystyrene box to keep our colonies in, and that gives us easy access to keep an eye on the water in the nests and such. But also, because it's a polystyrene box, you tend not to have the same risk factor associated with fridges sucking the humidity out. If anything, it retains that humidity within the box, and therefore you tend to find the nests don't dry out quite as quickly. When we then get to the end of hibernation and we're looking at bringing them out, it is just a case of, getting the temperatures up, slowly, not massively slowly. We're not talking about taking weeks, but you don't want to temperature shock them. So I tend to move them out of the garage and place them. I'm fortunate. I've also got a workshop where we make all of our equipment, and I tend to put them in one of the cooler corners of the workshop, which is a bit warmer, so that will take them to about 10, 12 degrees. They stay there for normally around about 5 days a week. And then I will take them into one of the colder rooms in the house before finally returning them to the famous ant shelves. And it's just that slow transition. At every stage, you're trying to make sure that you don't induce any temperature shock. And the inherent risk with that is, as John explained there, with the issue with, water expansion happening in your test tubes with the temperature changes. There's also potentially an issue with toxins that are potentially built up in the ants' bodies over hibernation, where if you raise the temperature too quickly, they can become more of an issue rather than having chance to be expelled as the temperature is gradually rising. So yeah, just take your time with that. Make sure it goes over a good number of days rather than a day or 2 days, and things should be pretty much straightforward. Once we're out, then we're on to the first feed, which is always an exciting one, and I'm sure you're coming on to.
Yeah, that's one of the best moments, is the first feed. The thing to mention is what I've done in the past is I took them out of hibernation. I gave them food the same day. The ants will still be sleeping. They won't. They will need this 1 or 2 weeks to wake up from the coldest time of hibernation. It's like imagining that you're just waking up, your alarm rings, and bam, you're running or something like that. You need the slow start. You need to wake up and get the brain working, walk a little bit around before you go out and take this run. You can't just wake up and suddenly run. 2 seconds after you're opening your eyes. And it's the same with the ants. So if you are feeding them the first day you're taking them out, they will not even leave the cotton. If they are also, what you tend to see within a nest is they will bulk together. They will all go into small balls and stay in one side of the nest simply just because that is what they do in the wild. They curl up together and they are together. What I forgot to say is before hibernation, the ants won't need protein because the protein doesn't need to be fed to the larvae because the larvae won't develop. But what they tend to love getting is a lot of carbohydrates. So I always boost my colonies extra carbohydrates. Once I start turning the temperature down, give them a lot of sugar because this sugar is what keeps them going throughout the winter. Although they are not going a lot, it is still what keeps them going throughout the winter. But yeah, then you can feed them the first time, and your colony is back up and running. Is there anything you want to say before we go on to the next topic, guys?
Just if it's your first year and you caught a queen sort of now in June, July, and Alex has said, you'll get to hibernation with maybe 15, 20 workers. When they come out of hibernation, that's when they're going to really explode. That's when the fun's going to start.
Yeah, so true. It is so true because that is when I feel like once the queen have had that first break, she really, what I tend to see is she pops out so many eggs. And not even before the eggs turn into larvae, she's back at again and just firing out eggs left, right, and center, which means not that long after, lots of workers. To not only say if they also had a big larvae storage, they'll also have a lot of larvae. So I love taking my ants out of hibernation. You haven't looked at them for ages. Suddenly you have them again, and they are growing faster than ever. So it's always an exciting time for me. But with that being said, I think we should go on to the next topic. Now, it's a little bit different, but now where you have a little bit of a bigger colony, I still wouldn't necessarily recommend you to move them into a nest. You can still have them. It's really what you want to do. It is a little bit further down before we talk about setups, but I feel like we should talk a little bit about it now because you have a few different ways of going. You have the tubs and tube method, which is now where your ants are out of hibernation, they will grow faster and faster, and you will need to give them more space. And it'll be very hard to feed them within this test tube because there's simply too many workers, and the workers are now old enough to actually become curious and want to escape. And that is where if you have a feeding pot, a little feeding outworld, a very small one, that'll also be too hard. So what I tend to do is to get my first proper outworld. This will be a small outworld, not a big one, not a half-meter big outworld. A box 10 by 10, 20 by 20, a small box that you can either purchase from AntBoy or you can make one your own. But a box with some good ventilation, and you can then hook the test tube up to this box, or you can put the test tube inside and make some kind of door into this outworld because it will simply be too hard to feed them within the test tube. And the thing with outworlds is, of course, that I personally have done a lot of DIYs. I've done a lot of the one thing and the other thing. But what I've learned over the past few years of keeping ants is it is just, from my perspective, if you have the budget, buy a proper outworld because it is just easier. Because if you have a proper outworld, it will be ant safe. So the ants cannot escape once everything is closed. And if you're buying a proper outworld, you will have a lid, and you can take the lid off, and you can feed them, and you can put the lid back on. If you're doing something DIY, you will have the risk of ants escaping when you take the lid off because it isn't as if you even have a lid. But that is where you have escape prevention. Now, I haven't used that many different kind of escape preventions. There is a few types. I think a store will be the perfect guy to ask because I think... Pete, I'm guessing you have everything for sale without being sure?
Yeah, and certainly escape prevention is very much a key topic, especially, given where we came from, me being the reluctant parent to a junior ant keeper. I was keen to make sure that we didn't get any ants roaming the house because that would mean that the wife said they've got to go. So our first main colony was indeed Lassius niger, and after their first hibernation. That second year, the colony started to really boom. At that point, we were doing a very basic setup, which was essentially a very, very small fish tank, which had a lid on it, but again, it wasn't necessarily ant safe. So it was a case at that point of getting a suitable barrier that the Lasius couldn't cross. For those of you who've kept any sizable colony of Lasius, what you soon come to realise is that those little monkeys can cross pretty much anything you're going to put in their path. So we tried Fluon or PTFE that was on the market at the time. They walked over that like it wasn't there. We tried Vaseline. They walked over that like it wasn't there. We tried baby powder or talcum powder with rubbing alcohol and put that on. It lasted probably 24 hours before they crossed that as well. And there's not one barrier that is the best for every single species of ants. It will very much depend upon the conditions that you're keeping them in. So, on our store, we've got 2 barriers that we use and that we recommend. One of them is the PTFE Fluon. That tends to be the one that you see used by the likes of Ants Canada. It's quite popular on YouTube. It's the one that's used in laboratories for insect containment. And it works incredibly well in arid, dry environments. If you live in a humid environment or you've got a humid setup, that PTFE will fail quite quickly. And it's also a case of making sure that you clean it off thoroughly before reapplying it, which can be a bind if you've got several hundred, if not thousands of ants trying to get out of there. So the other one that we have is called Anti-Climb, and that's actually an oil-based barrier. So that goes on, basically a little application wand, wipe it around the interior, smear it around them with a very clean piece of cotton wool to the point where you've virtually removed it all, and that will leave a very, very fine layer of residual oil. That is the barrier that kept our Lasius niger from getting out of that tank, and it's the barrier that I would say we use with 90% of our colonies, and is very, very resistant to them getting out. The only ants that tends to fail with are ones where they have a tendency to pick up bits of substrate and build little rafts across it. So that would be more of your Solenopsis and quite advanced species where that would be more troublesome.
Yeah, I have. I was gonna say the same thing. I've tried PTFE and it works fine. Again, I have a leafcutter colony, and the problem with leafcutters is they need very high humidity. They are not at all beginner friendly, so it's nothing to think about. I tried. That was before I really knew that PTFE had to be in a dry environment. They crossed my thick barrier within an hour, simply because it didn't work, because I hadn't done the research on PTFE. I have then used oil barriers, and the ants just put trash on the barriers. But a problem you can have, again, it's a bit hard because at this point, your colony can be thousands workers strong, it can be 20 workers strong. It'll be the same rules for everyone. You simply need to upgrade as you get bigger, because what ants tend to do if you don't feed them what they want, they will want a lot more to escape. If they don't have enough space for the nest, they will try to push a lot more on the barriers. And my leafcutters, they simply put trash on the barriers to get past them and come out, because I haven't provided them with the necessary space. So ants actually tell you quite a lot what they want. So if they are a lot on the walls and a lot trying to breach the barriers, it is often because either they want more food, or they want more space.
Alex, I can't tell you how right you are with that, to be honest. It's very much a call for help. So if you are finding that they're swarming up the sides or that they're trying to escape, it's either they are protein hungry, they're sugar hungry, they need some water, or they've not enough space. But basically one of those 4 things is wrong and is wanting, and the workers are being sent out to gather the resource.
And that's the thing. I have half of my outwells, they don't have any escape prevention on at all. I only have 2 colonies that actually need it. It's my Formica fusca, and they need it simply because they are crazy. They are all over the place. and it is my Campanodus nicobarbensis, simply because the outworld is getting too small for them. So I have to apply a barrier because they are just on the walls chilling. They are just on the lid chilling. They are all over the place. But for 90% of my colonies, I don't have any barriers at all, simply because the ants don't test the barriers. And again, I do have, it's a proper board outworld with a lid. So even though the outworld is closed, the ants can't escape. And I only open it once I have to feed them, and then I simply close it again. And on those outworlds, I simply don't have a sorry, I simply don't have a barrier, because it's not something I need. Is there anything you want to of course, we haven't even talked about John with the barriers. Is there anything you want to add, John?
I use Fluon myself, but one thing I would add to support what you've just been saying, Alex, when people are new to ant keeping, one of the other advantages of going out and buying a proper professional outworld sold by one of these ant shops is normally, sorry, Pete, I don't know if yours do, but I presume they do. But normally they have a lid which doesn't take the whole top off. It only takes some sort of central section out. And what this gives you is an overhanging lip around the outside. And whatever escape prevention you do end up using, when it's on an upside down surface, it works a lot better. The ants often will, yes, they can walk up your walls and go over a barrier, but as soon as they have to walk upside down on that barrier, they will fall. So it's another advantage of buying proper outworlds as opposed to, let's say, just using a fish tank or something which doesn't have that overhanging lip.
Yeah, and just that is the reason why I always recommend beginners. I run a TikTok channel and I've got a lot of beginner questions, and I would personally never go for DIY. If you have experience and if you know what you're doing, you could, but I would always recommend it is really worth, especially if you're a child with parents and the parents are scared that the ants may escape. If you buy proper setups, it is so much harder for them to actually escape because they are built for ants. If you're just putting something together after a YouTube video, yeah, it may not work as intended. Did you have anything to say, Pete?
Yeah, I was just going to say to on the back of John's comment there, absolutely right. You know, an overhanging lip on outworlds is really important, especially as the colonies do get, you know, much larger and into the hundreds and so on. So you will tend to find that, you know, the likes of the little founding outworlds we talked about before, which are just for a few workers, tend to be quite basic because they're only used for a very short period. But then as you do get into larger sized outworlds and such, then that lip again, you know, giving that upside down plane to put a barrier on does have a big advantage there when keeping them in. You're quite brave, Alex, you know, not using a barrier when you're feeding and things. I've done that myself before. But equally, I think when you've got a very hungry colony, you can still always get one or two slipping by, and once one or two do it, the rest of them can think, "Oh, look, that's a good idea. I'm going to."
Oh yeah. But again, what my defending is I read the colony. So I have a flowers colony. I see 10 workers in the outworld. I don't see them on the walls, so I don't apply a barrier. It is reading the colony and seeing how they react to you.
That's it, yeah. I mean, you know full well, certain colonies, when you take the lid off to do some maintenance in the outworld, they'll flood into the outworld and be, you know, basically with the knives and forks saying, "Where's dinner?" And other colonies will be quite placid about things.
Yeah, exactly. It is reading all of your colonies. But again, to be safe, you can always just apply a barrier. As far as I'm aware, a barrier, they last long. If you have a small colony, they pretty much last forever because a small colony won't challenge the barrier. But else, if you buy a barrier solution, they're usually in this, I don't know how many milliliters, I want to say 30. Is that correct?
It depends on the type of barrier. I mean, so for example, the anti-climb we have is 15 milliliter bottles, but
yeah,
that will last years
exactly.
across multiple colonies because you're using such an incredibly small amount of it at each application, and each application itself will last a couple of months as a minimum.
Yeah, and that's the thing. They last a long time again, and if your ants are challenging the barriers a lot and you have to reapply them often because they get through, maybe you need to feed them more, give them more space, or read the ants a bit more because there's often a reason. Our next topic, are we done with outworlds and escape prevention? Do you have anything to add, guys?
No, I'm good there.
No, fine.
Wonderful. So with your colony, you have them in the test tubes. They're on the outworld. They're growing out of the test tube. You have the very simple beginner way, if you have the ants in the outworld, to simply, if you have the test tube in the outworld, to simply put a test tube next to them. Because then they have twice the space, twice the real estate, and they can just move into that test tube. Once that is full, you can simply put one more. Then they may need a bigger outworld. Then you take all the test tubes, put them in a bigger outworld altogether. That's called the tops and tube method. That is the simplest way of keeping ants, and a few stores have also replicated them, so you can buy products that initially has 3 test tubes or 7 test tubes, and just goes with this very basic low maintenance setups, because test tubes are pretty much the most low maintenance ant keeping stuff you can get. I know I've said the next topic should be moving ants, but I feel like we maybe need to talk about what we are moving the ants into. Because once your first test tube is full, that's where the fun really starts, because that's when you can move them into a nest you've built yourself. You can buy a nest. This is where you can move them into a dirt setup where you can see the ants stick. I think we should just walk over the few different ant nests you can get. So what I know of is you can get a 3D printed nest. These 3D printed nests are often quite cheap because it's just a 3D printer printing a nest, and then they have a sponge, and then they have an acrylic plate as well, the lid, so the ants can't escape. And then you simply hydrate the sponge, and the sponge creates humidity. And we want humidity because most species need to have a little bit of a high humidity for the larvae to stay happy. If you're going with something like carpenter ants, you can actually put them in a wooden nest where they don't need any humidity at all, because the ants will lick the larvae and create the humidity the larvae needs themselves. But yeah, you can go with the 3D printed nest. They are very much on the market at the moment. A lot of people are getting into selling them because they are quite easy to make if you have a 3D printer and you know a little bit about how to print and what ants need. Then you can also go the acrylic way. Acrylic nests are pretty much the same principle with you have a sponge, but except that it's instead of the nest being made from 3D printing filament, it is simply made from acrylic slabs. So you will have like 5 slabs or 7 slabs, and then you once again have a sponge, and it's the same principle, just a different look. Then you have the white tongue nest. White tongue nest, fire brick. There's a lot of words for it. It is It is a brick you use in construction, at least in Denmark, when you're building a wall. So if you have a big room and you want to build a wall, you put these blocks to cut a room in half. But the thing with the white tongue is it's good at absorbing water. So you can have a sponge in a white tongue nest, but when you are filling the white tongue nest up, the sponge will let the water go and it will come around in the nest, and the nest will be humid it will create another kind of humidity. White tongue nests are often do-it-yourself nests because it's very easy for you and your son or yourself. I've had a few projects of just buying a block, cutting it to a small piece, and just having fun, because it is just something you can do with very simple tools, and there's a lot of tutorials if that's something you want to do. Personally, I think the big problem with a bare white tongue block is the humidity can come out quite quickly, because the block itself is good at breathing and getting the air out. So if you don't give it a little bit of paint, the humidity can come out quite quickly, and you'll have to hydrate the nest quite often. What I also forgot to mention with the 3D printed nest is you can also get nest with sponges, but you can also get nest with gypsum blocks. And personally, I know AntBoy. Sorry if I'm triggering you. I'm a little bit more to gypsum blocks because they can hold humidity for a little bit longer, where sponges are a little bit more maintenance, meaning you have to water them once a week or once every few days, depending on the room temperature. And a gypsum block can hold a little bit longer. But I think, except for the wooden nest, which I wouldn't recommend for that many species, and you have to do a little bit of research before thinking of a wooden nest, the last big thing is a naturalistic formicarium. And a naturalistic formicarium is quite simply you have a dirt setup. It isn't that simple. You have to build a drainage layer and you have to build all these things. It is quite simple as soon as you do a little bit of research, but it's not as simple as just buying a finished product. Now, the big thing with a naturalistic setup compared to all of the other setups I just said is the ants will dig and they'll go underground. And you won't be able to see them. You'll see a colony like you see them in the wild. So you'll see them walking around on the surface. And what I would recommend is if you have a small colony, I'd put them in a small setup, because then if you're lucky, the ants will dig around the sides. But else the ants will dig and live like a naturalistic life. Some people really love naturalistic setups. I'm personally not too big a fan of them because I lose interest within the colony because I simply can't see what's going on. And if the colony is sick, you can't see it as well. Anything you guys want to add? Starting with John, what would you like to add about different ant nests types?
Yeah, I'm the same as you with anything naturalistic. I want to, like I said, my whole point for keeping ants is watching what they're up to and what they're doing, and so I don't want my vision obstructed by the nest. I do think, though, that this is a common new ant keeper misconception. I see a lot of people asking about setups and they make the assumption that they must have some sort of soil, dirt or sand. It's not the case. They can live in these very sort of almost clean and sanitized nests without any type of substrate. And it's totally fine for them. But yeah, I'm a big fan of wet stone, gypsum, although I would like to try Whitong, and I know what you say, Alex, about Whitong drying out. But if you shop around the companies and you make sure you get the right ones, you can get them treated with this sort of seal, this sort of, I think it's made of like a waxy substance or something, but it's painted on the sides with this seal. And as long as they've sealed it properly, then it's okay for holding its humidity. But no, again, I don't like sponges. Sorry, Pete. And question for you, Pete, is why did you stop your Whitong Pro range and are you going to bring it back?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, of course, I've a few bits to add to this. I mean, this is the nature of what we do here. So, yeah, there's a couple of points, first of all. And I think it's firstly identifying that there are a plethora of different nesting options available on the market. Where we came from, as I explained earlier, is we came to it hobby first. You know, we were ant keepers before we started making nests. When we started making nests, we started making ones for our ants, given what their needs were with humidity, with temperature, how we wanted to observe them and see them, and how easy we wanted the upkeep to be. So going...
If you're talking, Pete, we have lost you. I shall also mention this time that once again, Pete is an ant store and he is making these products and we can't hear if you are talking. Can you hear me, John?
Yes, I can still hear you.
Wonderful.
I can't hear Pete either.
No, I think maybe something have popped up or once more. Okay, hello again, Pete.
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, you're back again.
Sorry, where did that cut out?
You were explaining that you started off making products based on the colonies that you and your son were keeping, and you started making products to suit the needs of those colonies, and then you were about to go on and tell us how that led to your designs and development.
Yeah, sorry, John. It was just that I think it was my son FaceTiming me to say good night, so I do apologise.
That's all right. That's all right.
Yeah, so I was just going to touch on the different types out there, because I think one of the biggest mistakes people make is choosing the setup that they like rather than the setup that the colony needs. Every ant species has different needs. A lot of them will have some...
Can I just interrupt? Something very important I want to get out there. Do not buy a big nest, buy a small nest for the ant size.
Absolutely. You're stealing my thunder here, Alex.
Sorry. Right. It's very important to get out there. Don't buy a big nest.
Number one error. Number one error is going out there, buying a really big, pretty-looking nest, and then introducing your newly bought queen with her 5 workers and brood, and wondering why she's looking all scared in the corner and not developing. ants like to feel secluded. They like that constriction of space. You know, if they were digging a founding nest themselves, they wouldn't dig 1-2 meters wide or 50 centimeters wide. They dig out what they need and they'd expand it as they need to. So they need that confined environment. Otherwise, they're going to start dumping waste in there. That can in turn lead to other issues. And they're also going to act more skittish, and it's arguably going to, repress their developments. So yeah, do go with something small initially, and then build upon size or put add-ons onto it that they can expand into. In relation to the nest types, I was starting to touch on sort of 3D printed. That's a technology that's become, massively available and very, very cheap nowadays. I was starting to say, I can go out and buy another 3D printer now for, give or take, £180 to £200, and I can start printing nests tomorrow on it. They do an okay job. They do on many occasions try to be everything to all species, which they're not, but they do hit a lot of the good common ground. White-ong, John, you were asking about white-ong. Not to be confused necessarily with general brick, or in the UK, some people talk about breeze blocks. It's a very different thing. White-ong itself is a particular brand. It's a very, very low density block, so it's incredibly lightweight. It's naturally mold resistant, which is a huge win. It's got a great capillary action for water, so it draws it in and retains a good constant humidity level. And when we make white-ong nests, we seal every nest so it retains that humidity inside and doesn't suffer from the evaporation issue. And to answer your question, yes, they will be back over the forthcoming weeks. We're just in the process of moving workshop before we put those back on the production line. Acrylic is a big favourite of ours. We tend to favour acrylic on many setups. The reason that we favour acrylic is it is incredibly, incredibly robust. They are nests that will literally last a lifetime and you can leave to your kids' kids. You are not going to have any issues with colonies chewing them, with warps, with deformities, with mould or any other common issues in there. And acrylic is often made, as ours are, from, if it's good quality, 3mm perspex that's been laser cut to a predefined design. And that should include good consideration for ventilation. It should include good consideration for humidity. It should include consideration for temperature gradients within the nest and how, if you're keeping a non-UK species, how it's heated and such. It should have appropriate covers. Ants like it dark. They will nest in the dark. They live underground for many reasons, one being the habitat, but the other being the absence of light. So there's a lot of considerations in there as well. And, quite a wide part of our acrylic range does have hydrostone bases in there, especially with the Smart Nest that we brought out about 18 months ago. And those hydrostone bases, don't confuse that with gypsum. Gypsum or plaster of Paris is, what we made models out of as kids. And it does tend to attract mold over time. It does tend to be something that certain species can excavate into and dig. Whereas hydrostone is far, far denser, but has the same capillary action to get water through it and retain humidity. And I've not yet come across a species that can excavate or dig that stuff out.
I think it's very nice to have you here to really say the inside.
Well, it just gives you a viewpoint. I mean, I suppose the bottom line is because we've always been hobby first, we could produce any of the nests that we've gone through there. We've got 3D printers, we've got, improved laser equipment as we've gone on over the years, we've got CNC equipment, etc., etc. We didn't come into this as a business with machines who thought, where can we make some money? I know we'll make ant nests. We came into this as ant keepers and thought, what do we need to make the right ant nest for our colonies and for the community's colonies? And it's a very different thing when you then think about having the right tooling to do the job. But more importantly, and something we've always prided ourselves on, is the innovation on design and keeping that moving forward to make it a better and better experience for the community so that they're having more and more success. The colonies are growing at the rates they want them to, and it's a rewarding experience for, especially where you've got kids involved. You want them to be successful in things. But I suppose the final point I'll make is just what you were saying, Alex, is, don't go too big too quickly. Your first nest, absolutely as a minimum, you should only be looking at that realistically when you've got at least 30 workers in that test tube, ideally more. You want then to go with, if you looked at our website and looked at the size 1 nest, they are small, but they will take you right up through 100 workers, and then you can start building on that. And then you can start building into other nest areas and do add-ons or go for something bigger. But be patient. As much as you've got to be patient in that founding period, you've got to be patient about the nests you buy and when you buy them too.
And I think that's a really big point, because I've purchased a few nests here and there, and what I did a lot in the beginning was I got a colony and I was like, oh yeah, I need a nest for them. Then I got a small nest, and I thought, yeah, I also need a medium nest because it's good to have it ready. And 2 years in, they were only halfway through the first nest. This was a slow-growing species, but still, you don't need to buy that mess. You just need to buy the small nest for your small colony. Then once they start looking crammed in there, you can think about getting a new nest. Again, like you said before, in the wild, they dig exactly what they need and no more, because that is simply how they work. That is powers wasted by digging, and that is why you will see them using the part of the nest that they need. And the dangerous part, like you also said, is if you feed them insects or whatever and they drag it into the nest, they can start making a trash corner. They can start piling their deads in the corner simply because they don't feel it is their nest. They feel that is the trash area because it is so far away for them. It may only be 5 or 8 centimeters away, but it's enough for the ants to think that it's not our nest, that is the trash area. And if that part gets too humid or you start having mold, it's not necessarily gonna happen. I have lots of trash areas within my nest. Nothing have ever happened, but it may happen. And that's the big thing. It may happen. And it doesn't look nice if you have a clean nest and you have a big trash area on one side of the nest. It doesn't look good. So it's something to keep in mind. And it is definitely, I like that a lot of stores nowadays have really started making these small nests as well. Because no hate towards Ants Canada, but the smallest nest you can buy from Ants Canada is like a 3-year-old colony size nest. It is massive, 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 massive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when people have come from the YouTube side of it and been watching Ants Canada, one of the first things they may well do is look at their website for inspiration and therefore see a nest of that size and think, therefore, that's what I need. That's what I need to start with. But it's not. It's just taking a step back. It's not about putting out a huge amount of money initially. Far, far from it. It's about putting out just what you need to, whether you decide to do tubs and tubes and keep it very basic, or whether you want something professionally made, just get something the right size to start it off.
Exactly.
I'd just like to say of all the comments that I see on Reddit in particular, where I just, oh my word, I'm thinking, there are so many people that will put a post up that says basically, I've been really interested in ant keeping for X number of years and I really wanted to start and I've decided to take the plunge and I'm starting. Will this nest be okay? Bang, with a picture of some giant nest. So people are going out and thinking that the very first thing that you need to do is buy a nest. And we've talked about the timescales here. You're catching a queen in July, and we're talking about moving them into a small nest in March or April of the year after.
Oh, I thought moving them into a nest in July the year after, so an entire year.
Possibly even as late as July the year after, an entire year. Buying a nest is not something that you need to worry about when you're looking for your queen running around on the pavement. It comes so much later. You can read so much, do a lot of research, but people seem to want to go out and buy something. And normally what they've gone out and bought is something gigantic, something absolutely gigantic that their colony's not going to fill for like 3-4 years. It's totally unsuitable. But yeah, I see that so often. It's so common. It's probably one of the biggest mistakes from new ant keepers that I see.
I definitely think
it is indeed, John. And I think if I might just throw in a comment there, I think that the main driver behind that tends to be seeing it as a false economy. If I buy a large nest, I can skip all the size 1, 2, 3 and just get the size 4, and therefore that will see me right for many years to come. It's not the case. That nest that you're picking up, you might not even have needed it for another 5 years. You might not even be into ant keeping at that point. You might not be fortunate enough to still have a colony at that point because something might have gone wrong. So start small, go with the initial nest, go with a beginner nest, nice small size. It's a lot less initial investment. And of course, if anything does go wrong, it can be reused again.
Something I would like to mention is if you are struggling to choosing a brand or choosing a nest, it's a good idea to just search whatever species you have. Let's use Niger on YouTube and see what other people are keeping it in. Not necessarily following one YouTuber who only uses one type of nest, but see generally what are people using, because that may lead you to think, okay, I see a colony in here and they are stacked in the corner because the nest is giant. It's very important to do research and do your own research and just take a look around before you're thinking. Because there is ads, you can buy massive nests that are pricey without ever needing it. And if you go to YouTube, you'll see that they are not in use, because generally ant keepers quite quickly find out once you are experienced, you use the nest you like and you use the nest you've had good experience with, and the other types you simply avoid. And yeah, again, don't follow one person, but follow the general mass to see what are people using. That was a very big help. Something we have not at all talked about during this whole podcast is having your ants in the dark versus having them in the red light. There's a big thing saying that ants, they cannot see through the red spectrum. Some ants can, some ants can't, and therefore you have red covers. The good thing with red covers is you can see into the ants, and the ants can't see out. I don't necessarily think it's something that we should discuss today, because it is some people don't believe it. Some people think, yeah, it's a big thing, but you will with most nests either get a black lid or a red lid with the nest, or simply just not have anything. And I personally think it's really dependent on your species, how they react to you looking at them. I have something like a Formica fusca, and just by me walking next to them, I can see that they're going crazy. So I have them in the dark. But something like my Lasius Niger, they don't care if I shake the nest. Almost never shake the nest. But I think you could almost shake the nest because they just don't care. Those I have in the light. So that is just something to have in mind. Look at your ants again. It's a lot looking at your ants, seeing what they tell you. It's hard to say it's a beginner. Look at them, see what they're telling you. But when you have the experience and look at the colonies, you can see they are hitting the barriers. They want something. They are all in the corner. They feel it's too big. They go crazy whenever you touch them. Maybe don't touch them as much, or they don't care at all when you look at them. Then maybe you can have the nest a bit more open and you can look at them a lot. I think I only have two or three of my colonies that are in the dark, simply because the rest, they don't care. They have gotten used to it. There is, of course, a period where they need to get used to it. But what I recommend regarding this is once the queen have her first workers, then you can start testing. I wouldn't recommend it when the queen don't have workers, simply because the queen can be a little bit skittish and she may eat the brood. Anything you want to add on that, guys?
I'll just say with Lasius Niger, it's not the amount of light, it's the change. It's how fast the light level changes. If they're in darkness, you take the cover off and shine a torch on them, they're going to run around like crazy. You're going to
would you like it in the middle of the night for someone to turn your flashlight on you?
Exactly. But if you gradually bring them from darkness, and that's why I red covers, I'm with team, they can see red, but it's dimmer for them. So take the cover off, let them have just red to begin with, give them 5 minutes at red light, then take the red cover off and give them 5 minutes with maybe just your little lamp on or something like that. And then if you want to, you can switch the main light on and have a good look at them, but just bring the light level up slowly. And that is actually the main reason I keep my ants in the dark, is because if you keep them uncovered, and let's say they're in a room where you've gone to bed or left it and it's dark, and then you've forgotten something and you walk in and switch the main light on, bang, you suddenly take them from full darkness to full light. So that's why I leave mine covered, so that I am able to switch my own lights on without disturbing them. But yeah, with Lasius niger, they can tolerate quite high light levels, no problem, as long as you bring them up to that slowly.
It's quite fun. My experience is quite the opposite. I feel my ants react to vibration, purely vibrations. If they're in the light, they react even more to vibration. But I can hear my Mesobarbarus colony. They are very tickling, so you can hear them when you walk next to them because the vibrations cause them to wake up, even though they are in the dark. But I think it's up to looking at your colony and seeing how they react. I have a lot of my colonies in the light, and when I turn the light on, they don't really react, and when I walk past them, they don't react. But if they do, I would of course react to their reaction. So I think it's again see how what they say to it. If they react when you turn the lights on, maybe you should keep them in the dark. If they don't, you can test, and if they keep not reacting, then you can test. But of course, something we're going to talk about in a second is moving the ants. If you have them in the dark, it is a lot easier to move them. Did you have anything to add, Pete?
Yeah, just on the subject matter. I mean, I agree completely with John. It's about the rapid change or lack of rapid change. So, the torch in the face in the middle of the night analogy works very well. It wouldn't go down well with us, and it doesn't tend to go down well with the colonies if we take a black cover off and immediately put a phone torch in there. So I do think, just having that few minutes of change in, if we're going to be viewing or filming them, definitely helps. But equally, it's very much species specific. So likes of Lasius niger that we've talked about are incredibly forgiving. I find that they do really, really well just under a red cover. And very much, as John said, I don't think that's because it's red. I think it's just because it emits sunlight and creates a shaded area more than it just being the red colour spectrum. Now, conversely, another very, very popular beginner species, which you mentioned there, Alex, Mesobarbarus, is particularly vulnerable to light, and it's particularly vulnerable to vibration as well. So, about 2 years ago, we brought the blackout covers to the market, and then in turn, we also developed the specific blackout nest with Mesobarbarus in mind. And, some of the Campanota species who tend to be quite skittish as well. And I found that with, like I said, Campanota screwentatus to mention, but one of them. So I do think blackout covers work incredibly well. I do think that the word of warning with that is don't just take it off and put a torch in there. Take the black off, leave the red on for a few minutes, as John said, and then remove that one before going in there. But yeah, all options, they should have some cover on there. I wouldn't tend to raise them just in natural light.
That is completely fair. And again, the thing with raising them in the light is you can maybe cause the colony to do worse because they may get another stress level. But that is up to the individual ant keeper. Now you have your ants in a test tube, but how do you get them into your nest? How do you move your ant colony? I don't know about you guys, but one thing I learned when I started was put a lamp on them and put heat on them. One thing I know for sure now I will never do is put heat on the old nest. I was once told that if you heat up the nest they're living in, they'll feel hot and they'll escape. I would never recommend that, simply because some ants, the thing with Lasius niger is the biggest place where they aren't beginner friendly is when you have to move them, because they can be very, very laid back. They can be very much, we don't want to move, we like it in this test tube. There's no water, but we like it in here. And it can be a very big, annoying thing for new ant keepers to move the ants. And they will then try heating the colony, and you may actually boil the colony simply because they don't want to escape. Or if you heat the colony and the test tube and the water starts seeking out of the cotton ball, like we talked about earlier, you can drown the colony. So I would personally never recommend using heat unless you are dealing with exotic ants. But I don't know, John, do you have anything to add? Or how would you move your ant colony?
Well, yeah, you're right about Lasius niger. They're absolute little sods to get to move. They'll cling to anything for ages. the method on the internet of shining a light on them to get them to move, they'll never move for that. They'll laugh at you. But my philosophy on moving, Lacey's Niger, is don't stress, don't bother about it. Why does everyone worry about moving their ants? Your friend here is T-junctions. Get yourself a T-junction ant store, sell them, you can buy them stuff so you can connect the outworld to one side, the nest to the other side, and the test tube onto the bottom of the T. They've got access to the nest, they've got access to the outworld, and they're living in their test tube. And then just leave them. When they're ready, they'll move into the nest. Why don't bother even trying to force them, just let them do it themselves. They'll move in when they're ready.
Yeah, very good point. It is something I've definitely changed over the years. I always tried stressing them. I think the one exception is when you're moving from one tube to another tube. How would you do that?
Yeah. Again, Lacey's Niger, absolute sods to get to move from one tube to another
Yep.
tube. I find
Yep.
the best way to do it, I tape the two tubes together and very slowly, not suddenly, but very slowly tip them up so that the tube I want them in is at the bottom and the tube I don't want them in is at the top, and it's now standing vertically. What tends to happen is they will all cling on to the cotton wool at the top initially, but bits will fall off, eggs and stuff, and that's why I say stand it up slowly. Don't stand it up so stuff falls straight down. Get any pupa, etc., to roll down. So stuff will roll down to the bottom. The ants will go down to the bottom. They'll perhaps even try and take stuff back up to the top, drop it, and it will go back down to the bottom. They normally won't stick that for more than about 48 hours before they'll just give up trying to cling on to the top and will move down the bottom. But that's, I find, the quickest and easiest way to get Lacey's Niger to swap tubes.
Yeah, I have it the same. I had a flowers colony that never moved. They never want to move, and they're such a crazy stubborn ants. I always, just like you, try to make the ants move before putting any kind of pressure on them. Then I try tipping the tube, and if it's a larger colony and I have an outworld, I don't recommend it. It is quite common, but it's not something I would recommend. Is to put them in the outworld by simply tapping them out of the outworld, out of the test tube into the outworld, and they can then move into the test tube. It's not something I personally recommend, just because it can cause a lot of stress on the ants.
And I did that with a flavus colony, and instead of moving into the new nest, they all moved into their water feeder. So it's got the little indentations at the side. There was about 2 ants in each little indentation going all the way around it. They moved the whole small colony into the water feeder rather than into the new nest.
I had this exactly same thing with my flowers. Actually, they moved the larvae in the holes, so they put the larvae in the holes and also lived in the water. I had to remove everything from the entire outworld before they finally decided to move into the nest. So yeah. Pete, what are your recommendations, or what do you do when you are moving ants, both from into a nest and also test tube to test tube?
It's again a widely debated subject, this one. I've also heard much discussion around using heat, using light, etc. Firstly, definitely don't use heat. I know, Alex, that's something you've said you tried once and moved away from. We've all been there and tried it. It's a dangerous method. If anything, if you're keeping an exotic, you may want to remove the heat from the old test tube, but certainly don't add additional heat there. Nothing wrong in uncovering it, making it light, making it, less appealing to them than the new test tube. But I'll be honest, I'm going to echo John's sentiments here with them. It's about them being in the most suitable setup that's not detrimental to their needs. So hearing you both talking about Lasius flavus as the example there, I have the same experience. I had a Lasius flavus colony that were doing really well in the test tube. Not particularly old colony. They were about 25, 30 workers, nice bunch of brood. But that old test tube had literally gone dry as a bone. There hadn't been water in it for, I'm talking 2 or 3 weeks. They'd had a lovely clean new test tube attached to the front of it with a nice dark cover over it and just wouldn't move. They simply refuse. And with that colony, as soon as you start seeing, the first 1 or 2 workers passing away because of emaciation and so on, you're then compelled to take some action, because otherwise you're going to lose your colony. So, John, I love the idea of vertically tipping them up and tapping them in. I tried that with this colony. Again, being flavus, they were particularly stubborn and wouldn't move. I didn't go quite vertical. But what I did in the end is, with a very, very fine pair of tweezers, I actually grabbed the cotton wool of the old tube and very, very carefully edged them closer and closer and got them out of the test tube, and then inserted that into the new one. It was a particularly troublesome task, but they were in there, and the colony went on to prosper well. So that there are times where you'll need to take, dire measures, but it's only in exceptional circumstances. So again, as John said, if they're not ready to move, don't panic. If the ants aren't panicking about it, you don't need to panic. I think when it comes to attaching the first nest, again, distance is absolutely key. When colonies are small, it's all about efficiencies. It's all about conservation of energy. So you don't want to have the test tube on one side of an outworld and the nest on the complete opposite side of the outworld, worthy to get across that open space to move in, because they're looking at efficiency. They're also looking at risk of predation during the move as well, and will be, very unlikely to move.
Another thing to add is it's so unnatural for an ant colony to actually move in the wild.
Exactly.
In the wild, they will fight until they die rather than move. At least for most European ants. So that's why this is so unnatural for them, that they sit down and say, no, we stay here because we don't want to get the queen outside. We will rather die here than move.
Exactly, and I think this is the trick. I think there's a bit of if you will, psychology involved in this, because what a colony won't do is they won't pick themselves up out of the nest and go over land and found a new colony. What they may well do is, if the chambers they've started off in start actually becoming unappealing, so they're drier, or there's vibration, or a mole's dug through it, or whatever it might be, they might move to other chambers, or they might create expansion chambers that they will move that founding chamber into, with the queen and the brood. So therefore, you can use that to your advantage. When you're attaching a nest, do it close enough to the test tube. Get it as close as you can do, so it feels to the colony like it's simply moving into another room, into another chamber. Don't have a lot of distance. So John mentioned about T-junctions. Absolutely brilliant. You can have the test tube on one side, the nest on the other, and the outworld on the third. That way, they're going to naturally see the nest as they're exploring the outworld to feed, and at some point they will move in there. But it's about having as little distance as possible, keep that new nest nice and dark and hydrated, make it more appealing, and they will eventually move.
Yeah. Another thing to do is, when you're moving from one nest to another nest, like you said, with the one chamber being unappealing, if you have a nest that you have to hydrate, simply stop hydrating it, because that may cause them to say, oh, our neighboring nest, the neighboring chamber is very like what.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they like the conditions we are. It has the right conditions, and the nest we are in now doesn't. Our larvae are dry. They need humidity. Let's move out of it. It's definitely hard the first time you move from a test tube to a nest, because it's the first move for a colony, and it's very scary for them. But I feel like we've talked about before, the ants generally will move if they need to move. After I've changed my mindset of why do I actually need to move them, with test tubes, it's always a bit hectic from my side. I hate moving test tubes. When it's nest, I give them the time they need, because they can move whenever they feel like it. Is there anything you guys want to add on this moving ants topic, or shall we continue?
Well, let's go.
Right, let's continue.
Wonderful. So next on the list is ant shops, but I think we will end with ant shops instead of taking them here, because that is a nice way of, if you want to hear it, you can hear it. If you don't want, you don't have to hear it. So with what you've heard now is, your colony is very big. They get a new nest. It's winter. You put them in hibernation. They grow bigger. You get them a bigger nest and a bigger outworld. They are in hibernation. All of this goes around and around. As big as a colony gets bigger, you can start making funny setups like Ants Canada, with tubing going all over the place, as a colony is a few thousand workers strong. What you need to remember is, for European ants, they can live very long time. and your setup can get very big in many years. So although it's very small now, in maybe 4 years, an ant colony can take up around 2 meters of your space. You can also compact it down with how you place us. You can make it very small if you want it, but just remember an ant colony can grow quite big. Especially the next topic we're talking about now is your next ant colony. Because what you tend to do, and what I personally would recommend, I would actually recommend if you're starting out to get a few different species from the straight away, especially if you have a big thing with ant keeping is patience. We've talked about 1 year after you get them, you can move them into a nest. A big thing is patience, and what I tend to recommend new beginner ant keepers is to get maybe 2 or 3 different ant species, because they will grow in different speeds. They will grow, Alaceus niger will grow quite fast, but something like a Camponotus herculinus will be easy to take care of, but they will grow mega slow, but you'll get a totally different relationship to it. So for your UK-based ant keepers, what would you recommend as their second ant colony if we're starting off with Alaceus niger? Starting with you, John.
Depends where you're going in ant keeping, but yeah, if you are wanting to progress and you're wanting to stay British, I would say that, and you want to get more complex and a little bit more difficult, yes, you can go Laceus flavus, but Laceus flavus are basically just a yellow version of Alaceus niger, except they're even more timid and do even less. If you want to move up, the species that I see a lot of my fellow ant keepers are getting into a lot. I don't know if I can mention channels, but there's a couple of channels that are part of the little circle that I follow, and they're all getting into Myrmica rubra. They love the red ants, and they say they're a lot of fun, very active, very good species. Now, as we discussed at the start of the podcast, they are semi-claustral and a lot harder to found a colony from just a queen. But one of the advantages of Myrmica is that they have multiple queens in the nest, and as the colony gets bigger and bigger and bigger, they will start to separate those queens into different areas of the nest. And I know that some keepers are getting to the point where they're keeping them in nests with multiple test tubes in them, and then they can detach one of those test tubes with a couple of queens and a bit of a colony in it, seal it up and post it to somebody to get them started with Myrmica. So yeah, it's probably a bit different to get started really than going out and catching a queen, but I would say that they do look a fun, interesting species that are going to be probably your next step if you're in the UK.
And if you want to stay native.
Want to stay native, yes.
Yeah, we'll hear Pete's answer. But a big thing with your second colony is exotic ants. But Pete, what will you say as your second ant colony?
Well, when we first started, as I mentioned before, with Laceus niger. We took quite a conventional route. We then got Laceus flavus, then got the Myrmica rubra that John mentions, and our first foray into non-native ants was to buy some Mesobarbarus, which obviously we had to buy because they're not native. And beyond that, Camponotus nicorbrensis. I think the answer to the question is really dependent on what you're looking to achieve. You know, what is it that's going to have you interested in the hobby? What is it that you find as far as behavioural traits or physical traits that you find appealing and that's going to be stimulating? So, for example, Myrmica rubra that John mentioned, multiple queens, can all live within the same nest, get to good sizes, swarm food quite nicely, you know, and they're very interesting. Downside, of course, is they do have a bit of a sting to them. So if you've got small children and you're not wanting anything with a sting, then you might want to avoid them. It's nothing major, but it's a consideration if you've got 50 of them up your arm. A very, very common, you know, next species, and one that I would tend to recommend would generally be Mesobarbarus. They're the European harvester ant. Absolutely fascinating. You know, they were found in very much the same way we've discussed earlier in the podcast. But the main difference being that a large part of the diet is from seeds. And they will get a large portion of the carbohydrates, even the proteins, from seed content. And alongside that, they've got what we call different castes of workers, or the polymorphic. It simply means they've got lots of different sizes, from media workers, which are very small, right through to the majors, who are really large and impressive and used to crush the grains. And those colonies will get to a really nice size. Ideally, you will want to start thinking about, heating requirements. However, they'll get by and do okay in, steady room temperature in the UK, 20 degrees plus.
Yeah, definitely. I think Mesobarbarus is a great beginner species as well. But I'm going to be very controversial because that is something, the thing I've faced a lot with. Again, I have a Danish TikTok channel where I have a lot of Danish followers that are just thinking of getting into Antkeeping, and I've had enough. Have had enough experience and also my own experiences with people getting Lasius nigers and falling out of the hobby simply because it's too slow. So what I've started recommending people is, if you actually want, again, I'm sorry, John, because you're not a. I mean, I don't know if you're anti-exotic or if you just have not chose to be exotic and species. But what I tend to recommend new beginners is actually to go with something like both a Lasius niger and a Camponotus nicobarensis, simply because a Camponotus nicobarensis is a very basic beginner exotic ant. They grow a lot faster than European ants, simply because they need to be heated. And you can very cheaply buy a heat cable, put it. There's a few different things you have to have in mind: how you heat a test tube, how you heat a nest, and stuff like that. But the difference between a European ant and an exotic ant, from Nikos to Nigers, is so big that it's something I recommend people start with, to have both. Because if you're losing interest due to the Niger Queen sitting there with her eggs, you can look at the Nikos already getting her second generation of workers. But again, it 100% depends on what kind of person you are. Are you losing interest in the hobby? Are you completely fascinated with this one species you have? Do you want to have a big colony? Do you want to have a small colony? Do you want big ants like carpenter ants, Camponotus herculinus, European native carpenter ant, massive, but also massively slow growing? It really depends on what you are seeking. But I am, if you are willing to heat, if you are willing to go out and heat a colony, the thing is also you have to skip hibernation. So while your Lasius niger is in the fridge, your Nikos will still give you lots of entertainment. But it's really what you want with the hobby and what you're seeking. But I would recommend, if you are up for the challenge, to also, because nicobarensis are very cheap. They are like 15 pounds, 16 pounds, where other exotic ants can be very expensive. That's my recommendation. But again, it really depends on what you are going for. I went for Mesobarbarus. It was a good choice, and then I got Camponotus vagus, a European big ant. But they were a little bit too slow, and I sadly lost interest in them many years back. Pete, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say I agree completely. I don't necessarily think it's a controversial point, because I think one of the big frustrations people have is the perception of how a colony will grow and the rate that it will grow at versus the reality of the first Lasius niger colony. And it's a very slow process. It does take the time that we've gone through. So I do genuinely think, if people have got deep enough pockets to get the setups right, i.e. the heat cable, the thermostat, and so on, to regulate the temperatures safely, Nicobrensis are an absolutely fantastic species to keep, because they just keep at it year round. They grow at a really good rate, and they will definitely keep you interested, with their activity levels.
But again, something I got from asking people on the Instagram what they thought. I got a question saying, be aware how fast species can grow, because something like Nikos, one queen can grow very fast. I have a massive setup, what I'd consider massive compared to my Lasius niger setup, and they are 1 year old. and shops actually sell them. Because the thing is, if you're going exotics, you have to go to a store, and stores actually sell them with 5 queens, and that is crazy if you are a new Antkeeper and you're getting those, because they will explode, and that's something people love. But I don't think just as big as a Lacius Niger colony can get in year 4, an exotic colony gets very, very big, very early. And it's just something to have in mention, and that's again have in mind. And that's again something I would recommend. Do research, a lot of research. Google this species. Something I found very interesting with my Camponotus herculinus is when I initially started, and I saw videos 4 years old, they have 5 workers. 3 years old, they have 10 workers. I got the same, and I knew it was very slow. But people are saying, "Why is your colony doing so much better than mine?" And I asked, "How old are you?" They're a few months old. Well, that's why it's a slow-growing species. So it's really about doing research and seeing what fits your style and what you want with the hobby. Anything we guys also Ants Canada, he of course mentions a lot that he's not into exotic ants. That is because in temperate environments, in areas, a lot of in Europe, we don't really have any problem with exotic ants. We do have a few invasive species here and there, but most of the time, the crazy Solenopsis fire ant species simply dies in winter because it gets too cold, and it's not the ant keepers who is the real problem with getting trafficking ants all over the place. It's the ants that crawl into a plant, a pot, into all of these groceries that then gets shipped around. So I'm personally 100% on Team Exotic. I do respect Team Non-Exotic, but I think, it's up to what individual Antkeeper, what they think of it. Is there anything you guys want to add?
I'd just say, like I say on my channel, I've nothing against exotics. If people want to keep exotics, that's fine, But what I will say is, if you are brand new, if you are at that stage where you are no real idea what you're doing and you're about to catch your first queen and start the hobby, I wouldn't get into exotics yet. I mean, first of all, as Alex has said, you have to buy them. You're going to spend money to buy these queens. And when you mess it up, you're messing up good money. Lacius Niger are all over the footpath. I would keep Lacius. I know you've got to be patient and not much will happen in that perhaps first year. But I would definitely say to anybody, do keep Lacius Niger for a while, even if it's just from catching a queen up to the first hibernation, that sort of summer period into the autumn, so that you've seen a colony grow, you've seen first workers, you've done some feeds, you've perhaps given them a small outworld, you've seen how they explore, just generally learnt a little bit about ants and how they work. And by then, I would say go into exotics, but I wouldn't advise going out and getting an exotic as like one of your first species, because if you then mess it up, it's good money gone.
Yeah, I can completely understand. And that's also what I say to people. I say to people that it is a totally other risk, because you are, like you say, investing money. And I think it really depends on who you are trying to meet. Is it a young guy? It really depends on who you are and what you're trying to achieve. I definitely say, from my perspective, it was great for me to have Nigers for 1 year and see how they did before I walked into the exotic Mesobarbers, and from there went crazy. But just by keeping my Nicobarbensis colony for 1 year, the amount of love and attention I've given that colony just because they are a lot active, I feel it's hard, and I think it's up to the individual Antkeeper, your budget. Have you seen one Ants Canada video, or have you seen all of our videos for the last 5 years and are just ready for everything? It depends on your situation, I feel like. Yeah, that's what I want to say. Shall we go on to the last part of this podcast? Believe it or not, we are 3 hours in, but we're finally hitting the last mark. That is ant stores. I don't quite know what to say with this, actually, because I feel like with what we said earlier with Ant Nest, it's a lot what you are seeking out to do. I think what's important to note is there are more than one store. You should go around, have people done reviews, have people any negative things and just look around. Because I mean, we do have a store with us today. Hello, Pete. I just think it's I see a lot of people buying. I don't want to say anything bad things about any stores, but I just see a lot of people going in and buying very big setups because that was what they were recommended. I think you should look. You think twice, because Antkeeping is almost a free hobby. I get a lot of questions: how expensive is Antkeeping? I say, well, my roach costs something, but they are breeding together, so that's not really a cost. My setups needs to be upgraded once every few months for a fast-growing species, or once a year for a slow-growing species. It's almost a free hobby compared to how much enjoyment you can get out of it. So I don't quite know what I want to discuss here with the topic and stores, other than I think it's good to actually contact the stores and talk with them, because there's you can chat with stores. I don't know, Pete. Do you have anything to add as a store?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's about having confidence and dealing with trusted people. Lean on the community. Make sure you've joined a good group. We talked about Facebook before in UK Ant Keepers. There's a massive community of like-minded people out there who've all dealt with a vast array of different stores. There's pre-vetted stores. There's also, lots of common shared experience. For me, when I was looking at the hobby before the store launched, I was looking really for what is that store owner's knowledge like? Are they just making products to sell? Do they actually keep ants? Do they have an interest in the hobby? Do they know what they're talking about? What's their online presence? Are they a genuine member of the community? Are they contributing and sharing experience? Are they approachable with messages? And all of the above. Check out reviews and everything. But you've got to have that confidence in things, and we're very, very fortunate in that, especially in the UK, but in Europe in particular, we've got a lot of very good stores out there. Personally, things to avoid: direct sales from messages, unsolicited approaches. Avoid paying for things via PayPal, friends and family, because you've no comeback. You want to make sure you've got buyer protection. If you're buying queens, you want to make sure you've got a live arrival guarantee on that queen, so that if anything happens in transit, you will be reimbursed or you will get a suitable replacement. And it's the same when you're looking at setups as well. You want the peace of mind of knowing whoever's designed that setup has come from the background of understanding the hobby. They're not just making something that looks pretty to try and take your money off you. It's not an expensive hobby. It's about spending as much as you want to spend to do it in the best way possible for your own budget. But it's that old adage, isn't it? Buy cheap, buy twice. I wouldn't say you need to spend a lot of money on it. You absolutely don't. But spend the right money in the right places and talk with the right people about it first.
Yeah, and as you mentioned with PayPal, I would, my own expertise I would 100% never recommend you go with eBay, like untrusted sellers. Even if you can get 100 Lasius Niger Queens for £5. Maybe it can be too cheap. There's a lot of people who just catch queens and try to just pop them out all over the place. Again, these guys often don't have reviews. And of course, if you're a small starting store, that may be against you then. But I think it is definitely you. A lot of people are just buying random stuff, and then they, like you said, with the life guarantee warranty thing. If you contact the seller, what happens if my ant dies? If you can't understand what they're saying on the website, I'll send you a new one, and see what if I feel like you've said a good, Pete. But I want to add just. I would never recommend to go with an untrusted seller. I would Google them. Is there unboxings on YouTube? Is it a real store? Is it a completely new store? If it is a new store, how do they respond? Do they say my nests are the best, or do they say my nests work? What's the response? I think personally, when I started, I just went to YouTube and looked at what other guys did, and that has worked out all right for me. But you can, of course, do a lot more research if that is what you want. What I've tended to see, if I've bought a lot of different nests, I've bought one nest from a lot of companies and just tried them out myself, seeing how do I like them, and slowly narrowed into what I find easy and what I find low maintenance within my keeping. I have 19 colonies, so I don't want every colony to have too much of a daily maintenance. Yeah, it is just regarding what you are thinking and what you like. Do you have anything to add, John?
Just research, like you've all said, research the companies and who's who. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but there are some, how shall I describe them? Very large, very cheap, very plastic, often very brightly coloured nests available from certain places. They're truly rubbish, a lot of those nests, and they're not going to do your ants any good. You need to find what is a good nest, what your ants want, and what good companies are, like Pete says, which are owned by ant keepers that are designing nests that are right for ants rather than just mass producing some giant bit. And I think people go for those enormous, brightly coloured acrylic nests. You two know the ones I'm talking about.
Yep.
Just because they are so big and they're so flashy, and they think, "Oh, this will look cool." They're really not. Do your research, please.
Yeah, and to that I can add, I never see them actually in use. I see people moving one colony in, and I don't see an update. But yeah, also what you said before with reaching out to the company. If it is a big company, it's very hard to reach out to them, and that may be a factor to think about. I can't contact them. Is that a good thing, or is it like, are we reselling all over the world, or what company is this? I don't want this to be a big thing at all. But you could also just go into the many Facebook groups and ask, what are you guys using? And don't look at all the hate comments, because a lot of companies a lot of people can say, oh, I had bad experience with this, never try them. Look at the constructive criticism. Mine is broke, but it got fixed, or whatever, because a lot of people are also out there to spread hate, which is something I personally don't like seeing. So I think it's just, I'd see online, see on YouTube what are people using, and then maybe ask online and see, does what people say in Facebook group fit with what I'm seeing on YouTube. From my perspective, I think it fits quite well. But I think, guys, unless you have something to add on this, I think we shall go to the outro segment. Do you guys have any final words regarding this last topic?
I think just one final thing to add is we've talked about speaking with the sellers and speaking with the stores. If you get any sense of any pressure to buy a larger nest, to buy a species that's a bit out of your price range, a bit out of your knowledge, a bit out of your depth, step back, take time.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, what's their motivation in going down this path? I will often, when people contact our store through Facebook or online, I'll be talking people down from buying a certain species or buying a ridiculously large setup. I'll be telling them they need to spend less money and don't get too heavily invested straight away. Conversely, you hear conversations which are going the other way around, and I will question the motivation there. So, you will get a sense for people as you engage with them. So, as we've all said, basically research, engage with the community, engage with the sellers, get a feel for things, and make your own judgment on them.
Wonderful. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. I think we have covered our entire podcast now. This was a lot. Well, I mean, it was an hour longer than I personally expected, but I feel it's been a very, very good 3 hours of just talking every single ant-keeping thing we could talk about. Of course, we have not gone into depth of keeping too much of crazy ants, but again, this is not a podcast for keeping crazy ant species. This is a very big beginner guide. And I want to say, where can we find you, John, once again, for all of those who have been interested? Where can we subscribe to the channel? Where can we contact you if we want to talk with you?
The channel's Basic Ants, YouTube, and Discord. You see, I have to look this up now. I don't even know because I don't like social. I'm not on social media. I don't have a Facebook. I don't have an Instagram. I've got my YouTube. Discord. I'm Trigger Hippie #5164, and I'm a member. I'm a member of. I've changed my name to Basic Ants on a lot of channels, but I'm a member of all of the common Discord channels. If you're in the UK and you follow a UK YouTuber, let's just put it that way without mentioning any names, a whole chunk of them have got their own Discord channel, and I'm in all of them plus others. So yeah, you'll find me around.
What else on the comments of your YouTube channel is a way of hitting you up?
Actually, no. I haven't put that there yet.
I'm guessing it. I mean, if they're making a comment on your YouTube video.
Yeah. I respond to all my comments. Yeah, but I meant, on YouTube there's a section at the end where you can put down your contact details. I haven't put anything in there of my YouTube channel.
It's overrated. It's overrated. Wonderful. Well, I'll say thank you for having you. Thank you for joining, John. Once again, Basic Ants on YouTube. And also, Pete, one final word from you. Where can we find you? Where can we contact you? And who are you, for those who forgot?
Yeah, so Pete from AntBoyUk. We've been manufacturing formicariums in the UK for 5-6 years. You can find us at AntBoyUk just on Google. Obviously the Facebook page as well by the same name. And you can join the community at UK Antkeepers on Facebook as well.
Wonderful. Well, I'd just like to say thank you both for joining this podcast. It's been very informative, also for me. That's the thing. Even as a 4-year-long antkeeper, I still learn a lot of new things. That's the brilliant thing about antkeeping, is there's so much knowledge to learn by the outside, and then you can also go into the different species where it's just crazy amount of things you can learn. But I want to say thank you both for joining, and I think we'll just do a very simple outro and say, I hope you have answered the questions you may have had, and I hope you will get your first ant colony, or maybe your second, or maybe your 10th, depending on how far you are. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. I am Ant Holfer everywhere, I think, but I'm mainly on Instagram, but I'm also on YouTube and pretty much everywhere. But I want to say thank you for listening all the way through this massively long podcast, and hopefully you will tune into some of the other podcasts if you have enjoyed this, and else you know where to find all of us. And with that being said, thank you for listening in, and have a great weekend or week.